Chapter 7:16. Little Tali split into over 100 small pieces, coating each and every one of the fragile pieces. For a moment, it looked as though Lionel had 100 long lines of silver stacked before him. Then, with a thought, they began to twist relative to one another. First they combined in groups of 5, twisting into a thicker line. Then those groups of 5 combined with 3 others like them to form groups of 4. Finally, those full bundles of 20 came together, forming a final line. All the while, Lionel's quill moved like lightning. His movements were so controlled and precise that he didn't have to pause little Tali's actions even a single time. He was absolutely perfect. When little Tali finally slipped out from and revealed the final product, Jack felt as though his eyes were about to bulge. However, as though he didn't notice, Lionel calmly attached the newly made bowstring to its body and lightly pulled. The twang of a bowstring seemed to pluck at the hearts of all those who saw it. Bloop blop, little Tali's many parts came together as one and happily landed on Lionel's hands, snaking around his fingers until it snuggled around his wrist. It was only at that moment that Jack realized that Lionel hadn't used his force crafting gloves from beginning to end. He clenched his jaw but still couldn't move an inch. "I'm not one to be bullied in silence," Lionel said. "Seniors like you can't be considered my senior." Who knows whether it was by design or coincidence, but Lionel didn't call Biennala elder this time. His message couldn't have been more clear. "I was lucky this time because my force crafting saved me. But it's impossible to tell what would happen if I was on the outside. I can only hope that there's a swift and justified punishment." Lionel's plain words were like hammers to Jack's heart. Unfortunately for the latter, he was soon forcefully teleported out. Jack appeared on the outside, finally regaining control of his body. His first instinct was to blast all the energy he had been holding in toward the shop. But before he got a chance to, he felt like several eyes had landed on him. Jack's aura completely deflated. His rage had nowhere to vent itself and his embarrassment seemed to have only increased by several times over. Without a word, he turned and sliced through the crowd on his way out just as the picture above Blackstar reverted back to its silver and black emblem. The crowd all watched silently as Biennala, followed by his 2 wives, departed. Though none of them said a word, somehow the silent condemnation was even worse than receiving a verbal barrage. On a distant rooftop, Sale watched on in silence. She didn't even notice when her eyes had begun to brim with tears. "What are you crying about?" Jerson frowned, looking at Sale as though she had lost her mind. What was wrong with this senior sister of his? Jerson didn't like Lionel very much to begin with for obvious reasons. Plus, he also didn't know much about force crafting. He just barely knew enough to know that it was impressive for Lionel to defeat Biennala, but he didn't quite know how impressive. What he felt, though, was even if this was a pinnacle achievement, it definitely shouldn't be anything worth crying like this over. Right? The only thing that truly shocked Jerson was the fact Lionel was actually able to send a 5th-dimensional existence packing without lifting a single finger. Sale wiped her eyes with a forearm and smiled, not bothering to explain in too much depth. Jerson didn't quite get it because he was one of the few who would have fought for his rights against his seniors regardless. Even when he found out Lionel had a great background, he disdained him more than respected him. In the mind of a talent like Jerson, he could already fight for everything he wanted, so Lionel's words made no difference to him. However, if everyone was like Jerson, the organization would have never fallen to this point to begin with. By now, it had little to do with him and everything to do with those below. She didn't know what Lionel had done, and she had a strong feeling that this was definitely not the first time he had planted such seeds, but the result was something she was seeing right before her eyes now. He's doing all of this just for revenge toward a person who didn't even dare to say his name. How good would it be if he was doing all of this for less petty reasons? What result would there be if he did it because he loved Valiant Heart? In another distant building, Raylion finished the last of his meat, leaving behind nothing but an exceptionally clean plate of bone. These petty tricks are meaningless if you don't have the strength to back them up. As quickly as you can light a fire in their bellies, they can just as quickly be extinguished. Lionel collapsed to the ground the moment the images disappeared. Compared to his previous appearance, his current look was pitiful. In fact, he looked as though he had placed a step into a long-since-prepared coffin. He had really outdone himself this time. He could have just sent Jack out right after locking him down, but he had insisted on making his bow first. If it wasn't for the fact that Jack had been so focused on his craft and forgot to struggle with all his might, Lionel really would have collapsed first. Lionel was able to rely on a combination of his divine armor and his prepared force arts to barely deal with a single weak 5th-dimensional existence in a prepared environment. But, in order not to reveal his divine armor too early, He put even greater strain on himself that he needed to. Now the world around him was completely blurry. Even as Lionel's consciousness faded, his lips still curled. He could consider phase 1 over. Now came the fun part. His fists were really itching. Chapter 717. If there was ever such a thing as rolling in merit points, Lionel had definitely reached the epitome. The sales his shop reached day in and day out could make even some elders bleed. Of course, much of these merit points went toward buying more materials to sell even more. However, even with this being the case, the profits alone were astronomical. There was simply no other place in Valiant City where they could get such cheap high-level weapons. It could be said that Lionel single-handedly raised the strength of all black and white belts by at least a level. As for blue belts, due to the fact he never sold weapons above the Tier 7 level, their strength remained about the same. When Blackstar truly began to pick up steam, the Ore factions made their move, each signing contracts with Lionel. Like this, Lionel didn't even have to worry about acquiring ores himself. Every week he would receive a large supply of his own. It was no surprise then, that the ones who suffered the most were the King of Ores faction. Not only had Lionel used their foundation to build the impenetrable Blackstar, but they obviously couldn't sign a contract with Lionel, who was now effectively holding what amounted to about a 10 to 20% share of the ore market. This didn't seem large, but when it was considered that most of the customers the ore factions had came from merchants of the Milky Way, the fact Lionel managed to swallow up such a large share was enough to make anyone mad with greed. All of this said, there was only so large such a small shop could grow. Even setting aside the fact that 70% of all the sold weapons, armors and consumables were crafted by Lionel personally, Valiant Heart was only so large and there were only so many students. Of course, the consumable and repair market kept the merit points flowing in droves. But even with this accounted for, there was a cap. This cap, however, wasn't a bad thing. In fact, Lionel had accounted for its existence. What Lionel wanted the most out of this place was a method to cure Aina. That was his main goal. His so-called revenge against Raylion and Hephaestus was nothing more than a blip on his radar. He hardly took them seriously. In order to do this, he needed to bring the segmented cube to phase 3. If the shop kept growing to infinity, it would be difficult for him to find time to do any of this. Up to now, the cube had been slowly absorbing the fifth-dimensional force in the atmosphere. However, at this pace it would still take several years to finish. If it wasn't for Lionel running into a force eruption, the segmented cube might very well still be in phase 1. There were two methods that Lionel could think to accomplish this. The first were force crystals. It had to be remembered that the cause of the force eruption Lionel faced was a force crystal mine. Each force crystal presented a high concentration of force. This might speed up the process. The issue with this, though, was that Valiant Heart Mountain keeps a tight lid on all fifth-dimensional resources. Whether it was ores, herbs, or anything of the like, students like Lionel would never have a chance to lay hands on them. And this made sense from Valiant Heart's perspective. After all, what would fourth-dimensional brats do with such resources? They'd probably end up selling them off to their enemies. To the elders of founding peak, fifth-dimensional resources were all strategic. It was they that decided how strong or weak their Valiant Heart would be. They couldn't possibly be allowed to reach the hands of others. Of course, it wasn't necessarily impossible for Lionel to lay hands on a fifth-dimensional force crystal. He was certain that Valiant Heart had at least one vault of such treasures. In order to access them, he just had to become a bronze crafter. He didn't believe he couldn't exchange fifth-dimensional weapons for these resources. In fact, the elders of Valiant Heart might fight over him just like their students were. However, there was another issue with this. In order to practice with bronze crafting, Lionel needed fifth-dimensional ores. Theoretically, thanks to his ability, he could dream sculpt such ores and practice in his dream world. But to do that, he would need to actually lay eyes on them first. By now the problem was obvious. Lionel had a workaround though. If he dream sculpted the bronze spears in his spear domain, then broke them down to the ores that made them up, he could then practice enough in his dream world to break through. But the logistics of that were more difficult than they seemed. Luckily, there was another option. The more Lionel learned about the Valiant Heart Zone, the more intrigued he became. According to Kayla, the training rooms that Valiant Heart were so proud of, even the one Lionel took his white belt exam in, were all products of treasures taken from the zone. The rewards for bringing such things out were most definitely not stingy. Knowing this, Lionel was already certain in his choice to enter the Valiant Heart Zone. Who knew, maybe he would find something to directly boost the segmented cube to phase 3 without having to trade anything in. Blackstar already ensured that Lionel would reach the merit point minimum for entry into the tournament. This tournament would have spots of entry on the line. So, Lionel's only task at this moment was to make sure he was strong enough to snag these spots. Though Lionel had won his battle with Arte, it also taught him that he was still beneath the blue belts in raw strength. With something like Aina's life, he would never let the shave be so close. With those thoughts swirling in his mind, Lionel prepared a training regimen for himself, consulting with the dictionary. His first step was to raise his metal body to its next bottleneck. And now, he finally had access to more ores than he knew what to do with to accomplish exactly that. Chapter 7:18. Lionel sat in a private room, looking at piles of ores that dwarfed his body in size. He had long since finished his work for the day, so he was focused entirely on himself. Of course, with Lionel's level of skill, he could complete even a Tier 7 weapon in barely 10 minutes. As for weapons below that level, he was even faster. Considering how few could actually afford a Tier 7 weapon, he only needed to make a small number a day. So, after about 3 to 4 hours, he had already wrapped up. My metal body is at the lowest Tier 1 right now. The meaning behind this was simple. Lionel's body, when his runes were activated, was as tough as a Tier 1 fourth dimensional Oregon. Since his foundation was built upon herb ore, the strength of his body scaled along with it. Normally, it would be very difficult to raise his body beyond this. However, Lionel had the puppet master to thank for why this was not the case for him. After absorbing the puppet master's force and healing his body, Lionel's senses picked up on the changes to his body. Though there was no great change to his strength, the bottlenecks he would have experienced all the way up to the Tier 4 level were completely cleared. All Lionel had been missing to improve were the ores themselves, and now he had them. What Lionel had left was a choice of how to progress his metal body. Ultimately, all metal bodies were excellent at defense. How could they not be? Metals and their ores were among the toughest materials in all of existence. However, this didn't mean that there weren't certain choices to be made. It had to be remembered that from this point on, Lionel could give himself affinities through his metal body and his divine armor. His divine armor could be considered to be a temporary boost until he switched to a new one. However, his metal body was permanent and had to be slowly grown over time. But in this way, much of Lionel's choice had already been made for him. Without a doubt, Lionel's strongest asset was his innate force node and his Scarlet Star force. However, he couldn't even use it without burning himself from the inside out. The best way to deal with this was obvious. Lionel needed to refine his body with star, light and fire elemental ores until his body could withstand his own strength without imploding. After consulting with the dictionary and using some of his own deductions and speculations, Lionel came to a decision. Ores that carried 3 elemental characteristics were too rare and often wouldn't appear in lower dimensions. As such, he could only choose 3 separate ores. The first was Blazing Night Oregon. Right from the very beginning, if others knew that Lionel actually wanted to absorb such a thing into his body, they'd believe him to be a maniac. The ore looked like a crystal with a dancing red-black flame within. Just gazing upon it made one feel as though a shiver was crawling up their spine. Blazing Night Ore was a fuel-type ore. Much like how ancient Earth used coal and crude oil, Black Night Ore could fall within such a category of combustible energy as well. It was a favorite of force crafters and force pill crafters who might need an extra boost of heat during crucial moments. The method of using this ore was quite special. Rather than actually combusting them, they would be rubbed against an abrasive material until the ore began to give off fine dust particles. These fine dust particles could then be added to a flame in intervals to explosively increase its destructive capability and its heat. Though a flame seemed to be dancing within the crystal-like exterior, it was nothing more than an illusion. The danger wasn't hidden within, it was the entire ore itself. If it came into contact with any heat source, boom. Yet, Lionel had an entire pile of them stacked up in front of him in what could only be said to be far from a controlled environment. The second ore might be even more dangerous than the last. It was known as refractive gold. Living up to its name, refractive gold was an exceptionally beautiful ore. Beneath the dark blacks and silvers of Lionel's private room, it seemed to dazzle all the more. But even Lionel didn't dare to bring it out into the sunlight casually. Refractive gold looked like one might imagine a golden crystal to look like. Much like the previous ore, it too looked a bit transparent. But, whereas Blazing Night Ore's danger was an illusion of the eye, refractive gold's danger was completely invisible, until it wasn't. There was no dancing fire within it, but refractive gold had a special structure that could turn even the most benign of light sources into a laser beam capable of obliterating a Tier 4 existence. If a light was trapped by the ore just right, it would bounce around its inner mirrors, before concentrating into a beam that would rival even the best of lasers even the current Earth had to offer. It was safe to say that whoever pioneered the use of this or as the vessel type or had to be a powerful individual unafraid of such things. Finally there was the final or. This one was the rarest of the bunch, and though it was nowhere near as dangerous, it was definitely by far the hardest for Lionel to get his hands on despite also being a fourth-dimensional or. Technically, this or was known as Star Core Oregon. And like herb or, it was not only a foundational type or that could form the base of any craft, it also had the same name regardless of its stage of evolution. This or was produced at the core of any dying star at and above the fourth dimension. As one might expect, it could be found in large quantities. But even still, due to the difficulty of mining this or, its price was still sky high. This fourth-dimensional star core or would be the foundation of Lionel's metal body. He would absorb 3 parts star core, 2 parts refractive gold, and 1 part blazing night and shoot to tier 4 in one sweep. Chapter 7:19. Lionel began to absorb the ores one after another, without a care for how dangerous they were. No matter how volatile they were to others, to Lionel they only represented strength. In that way he was much more like little Tali than maybe even he knew. What Lionel most looked forward to, though, wasn't just the strengthening of his body, but rather the synergy his metal body had with his mage core. Under normal circumstances, the absorption of these ores would result in the following changes. Taking in blazing night or would increase Lionel's ability to suppress the volatility of his Scarlet Star Force. The ore itself had an uncanny ability to remain inert without the presence of flames. When this essence was taken in by Lionel, he too would gain this ability to suppress. Taking in the refractive gold would give Lionel the ability to better control and concentrate. Finally, Star Core was known for its heaviness. It was a foundational type or well known for increasing the weight of a weapon far beyond its proportional size. At the same time, this added weight would both stabilize and increase structural integrity. It could be said that by absorbing Star Core, Lionel was heavily increasing the density of his body and also its defense. This would offset the volatility of Black Knight perfectly and stabilize refractive gold to give him even more control. However, this was only if Lionel hadn't grasped Camelot's magic system for himself. When Lionel formed his mage core, his variant earth affinity did not appear as one of the petals despite the fact space. His weakest affinity, should he not use his divine armor, had a flickering black-silver petal for itself. The reason for this was simple. Lionel had made his variant earth affinity the stem and roots of his mage core. This didn't seem like a big deal and even seemed to make sense. After all, what better stabilizing element was there outside of earth? This was only more so for its metallic variant. However, when Lionel's metal body is taken into consideration, the fundamental nature of this choice comes with implications far more than something so simple. A mage core is the representation of a mage's magic. In Camelot's magic system, it roots a connection between body and spirit, allowing magic to be controlled more like the extension of one's body rather than requiring the use of a force art every time. This was why, after the formation of his mage core, Lionel was able to wield the elements and bend them to his will even without evoking any spells or mage arts. And it was also why even the most basic of spells had gotten a massive boost even without Lionel modifying them. This would be the same for anyone who formed a mage core as long as their affinities were high enough. So what was the difference with Lionel? The core lay in his metal body. Due to the characteristics of his lineage factor, Lionel's mage core and metal body formed a symbiotic relationship where one could feed off the other in an endless feedback loop. This was the fundamental change that occurred when Lionel made his metal variant affinity his root and stem. This meant that whenever Lionel absorbed ores, the changes would occur not just in his body, but in his magic too. To put things as simply as possible, while Lionel's body gained all the aforementioned boosts, his magic subtly changed as well. Or maybe the changes weren't so subtle at all. First, Lionel's flames gained an explosive characteristic thanks to blazing night. If before they could just emit heat, now they wrought destruction. Even a simple fireball spell from a tier 4 Lionel would manifest like a nuke being dropped from the skies, maybe not quite so much in strength, but most definitely in feel. The second change to Lionel's magic would be his ability to concentrate his mage arts into incredibly fine beams. This would be especially so for his light elemental magic. Though this effect would be less prominent than the explosive characteristic he would gain, if used properly, it could be even more dangerous than the first change. The third change would be in thanks to Lionel's star core. Though Lionel had yet to learn any star elemental mage arts, not having had the time to research just yet, this wouldn't change the fact that he could still bend the element to his will with just his body alone. He could effectively add an impossible amount of weight behind his every strike with a thought. Yet, as amazing as these changes were, none of them touched upon the most fundamental and most drastic change. And this is where the prowess of this synergy began to show itself. With just a thought, Lionel would be able to cast Earth Elemental Force arts that manifested the character of any one of these ores he was currently absorbing. In fact, if he wanted, he could even form any one of these ores from thin air no differently from how he might have formed an earthen arrow from a mage art in the past. In the past, Lionel's variant Earth affinity would add a slight metal sheen to his mage arts. This change would increase the strength of his casts by a measure to be beyond that of a normal Earth mage. However, the effect of this was limited. It would strengthen an offensive attack like Earthen Spear, or a defensive art like Grand Bell Construct. However, when it came to other more unique Earth Elemental arts, it would be useless and even sometimes become a hindrance. However, now Lionel had more control over exactly what variations would occur because he could now evoke specific ores, bringing his Earth magic to an entirely new level. With his metal body as his foundation, and his mage core as an equal partner, Lionel believed that should he ever learn how to perfectly integrate his spear force with his magic, he would be undefeatable even amongst those several levels higher than himself. Chapter 720. Lionel felt his strength soar. Beneath his closed eyelids, his eyes flickered with all sorts of colors and even his hair began to dance with a mysterious light. Lionel's skin shimmered like polished metal even beneath the dim lights of his private room. When his eyes opened, though, his gaze was surprisingly calm, albeit far deeper. Looking at the emptiness in front of him, Lionel sighed. Improving his metal body was definitely not cheap. And even though now he could probably swipe at the air and make more ores, that obviously took stamina. How foolish would it be for him to sap his energy just to gain more energy? Though it might be useful in battle to heal himself. But even then, it would be better if he just carried around a store of these ores for those kind of situations. The cost-effectiveness of creating these ores wasn't worth it. However, if it was a matter of using them in a strong attack or defense, that was a different matter entirely. The new mage arts Lionel wanted to create would be centered around these ores. This was why he hadn't gone out of his way to start formulating new mage arts on the level of the fourth dimension just yet. Only this way would he be able to maximize his strength. It seems that now is a perfect time to take Aina's advice and visit the Valiant Hall training rooms. Maybe I can finally get something out of this organization then. But first, Lionel took out a familiar ring. But he was instantly surprised by the feeling he had when he rolled it in his palm. Feels different? Lionel was certain that this ring hadn't changed at all. His dream sculpt made sure that he wouldn't make such a mistake and he had long since stored this mysterious ring into his dreamscape. So, the difference was definitely not due to a change in the ring itself, but most definitely a change in Lionel. So it's like this? Lionel's eyes glowed. The moment he touched the ring he pinpointed many things. First, it was made of fifth-dimensional ores. Second, it was formed of 7 different types of ores on this level. Third, he was able to pick out the exact ores used with a simple touch. Fourth, he was even able to see through some of the smelting and crafting processes the ring had undergone. Lionel felt like if he were to dream sculpt the ring now, it would take him a fraction of the time it did before. What was shocking about this change wasn't the information because Lionel's dream sculpt had long since informed him of all of this. What was shocking about it was that the information had been transmitted to him in a completely new way. Lionel was certain. His Earth affinity had taken a massive leap forward. He had neglected such a simple thing. As Lionel refined his metal body, it seemed that his Earth affinity would also increase. But this increase was far more than what Lionel was expecting. The only explanation, then, was the synergy between his metal body and his mage core. At this moment, Lionel felt that he had the equivalent Earth affinity to a Morales family genius who had stepped into Tier 9 of their fourth-dimensional metal body. And the feeling was like standing high up on the clouds. Before, Lionel could only control a 10-meter range of space in this fifth-dimensional world. But now, he felt that controlling even 100 meters wouldn't pose much of an issue. Lionel took a deep breath and cleared his mind. Now wasn't the time to get engrossed in such things. What is this ring? Lionel finally asked. Ping. Replying to Seed, it is a key. Lionel raised his eyebrows. A key to what? The dictionary didn't respond. Lionel had experienced this once before in the Camelot Zone. It seemed that the dictionary didn't know the answer to this. Though the dictionary somehow knew about the Oryx and their hyper-evolution, but not about this, Lionel wasn't too surprised. From Lionel's understanding, the dictionary didn't know anything like one might expect a database to. In fact, Lionel was certain that the only data within the dictionary were the messages left by his father and his lesson plans. Aside from this, everything else the dictionary knew was based on deductions and scans. If it couldn't scan something to understand it, then it wouldn't have an answer. Lionel was quite astonished when he came to this conclusion because it meant that his father managed to create a device that was even better than his ability at doing what his ability was meant to do. Shaking his head, Lionel recollected himself. Where are the engravings from? Ping. Engravings are from a language not yet evolved. Lionel's pupils constricted. At that moment he understood. A language not yet evolved? That meant that this language already existed, but it had not gained the dialects or quirks of the engravings placed on the ring. The ring deduced that there was a language similar enough to these engravings, but not similar enough that they could be called the same. Almost like a comparison between English and Old English. That could only mean one thing. This ring was from the future. It sounded absolutely ridiculous when Lionel put the only logical deduction into tangible thought. But, oftentimes, the things that less intelligent people couldn't accept were things that those who were could easily. How difficult the concept was to accept didn't matter. All that mattered was that it was the only logical conclusion. As long as this was true, Lionel didn't care even if the dictionary told him that this ring was his son. He would accept it. What he needed to focus on was not how ridiculous the conclusion was, but rather on how to make it make sense. This was what separated the layman from the experts. And for that, Lionel already had an answer. In fact, he thought of it almost instantly to the point it made the original premise far easier to accept. This ring. It was from a variant zone. The only questions that were remaining was if this ring was from the Valiant Heart variant zone or another. How the hell had Senior Lou of all people gotten his hands on it? Chapter 721. Lionel didn't have an answer to his question. And unsurprisingly, neither did the dictionary. But Lionel didn't mind. Even if this ring led to a dead end, he could still accept it. Lionel knew that variant zones only appeared when a world was on the verge of collapse. According to Kayla, Valiant Heart managed to use a treasure they earned participating in the Morales family's air wars to maintain this zone and continuously benefit from it. Other than these facts, everything else was too variable to make any conclusions on. So, Lionel didn't waste any brain power on things he knew he didn't have enough knowledge to reach a logical conclusion with. Instead, Lionel stood and began to make his way to Valiant Hall. "Hello, I'd like to take a look at the training rooms you have available." Lionel soon found himself on the second floor of Valiant Hall once again. In fact, he could even see some black belts getting ready to take their own exams, and the receptionist he spoke to was the very same dead-eyed man whose disposition hadn't changed a single bit. Without a word, the man pushed a booklet to Lionel. With a quick look, Lionel realized that the training rooms of Valiant Hall were different from the ones you might find on Hero Peak. Rather than having specialized rooms, Valiant Hall had their training rooms separated into grades. The grades decided the intensity of the setting within the room, or more accurately, the range the settings could be used within. Though Valiant Hall was less specialized and also more expensive to use, it made up for it in convenience. For the current Lionel, they were actually quite perfect. "They'll take the S-grade training room then," Lionel decided. There were 3 grades below this. And unfortunately, the grades above this all require elder or equivalent status. So this was the best Lionel could do. The receptionist looked at Lionel. The prices were very detailed, so he didn't believe that Lionel hadn't seen them. A single day cost 1,000 merit points, and that was only if you used the simplest functions of the room like weight training or target practice. If you planned on using anything more special than that, the points would quickly rack up. Yet, Lionel hadn't hesitated. It seemed that this receptionist with a dead look was quite the recluse. There were very few who didn't know of Lionel's wealth by now. It was almost amusing that he was surprised. Lionel took a deep breath, standing at the very center of a spacious room. The S-grade training room looked almost identical to the exam room. It too was constructed of large meter-long and wide tiles, each of which was a perfect in-between for white and black. And it also happened to be in the shape of a perfect cube. The only difference aesthetically was that the S-grade training room was 100 cubic meters large while the exam room was only 20. Lionel waved his hand forward in a command gesture. Without much lag, a hovering control panel appeared before him, filling his eyes with fascinated lights. He was once again certain that this level of force crafting was beyond Valiant Heart. But now that he knew that these things came from the variant zone, it was all easier to accept. First things first, I need to work on my Bodis flexibility. Let's see. Lionel had already decided on this long ago. Having a metal body was great, but he had noticed during his run-in with the oryx that his body movements were growing stiff. If things continued like this, his lineage factors would end up restraining one another rather than complementing each other. His snowy star owl lineage factor should have given him great speed. But if his joints became a rate-limiting factor, then what good would that do him? The good news was that there should be a solution to this. The Morales clan's metal body, a lineage factor they relied upon to reach the top of the dimensional verse, wouldn't have such a glaring weakness. At least not so early anyway. The bad news though was that while Lionel's father had left him any and all techniques he would ever need with regard to force crafting, when it came to matters of actual combat, he abandoned his son completely. Lionel could almost imagine his father cackling somewhere far off in the universe, his feet up on a table and a grin on his face, watching his only son struggle. Why his father had done this, Lionel had no idea. But if there was anything his father was good at, it was being really stubborn about arbitrarily drawn lines. If he wasn't like that, Lionel probably wouldn't have spent his whole life thinking that his mother had abandoned them. Lionel still had a shred of luck left though. At the very least, the dictionary didn't leave him hanging this time. Dealing with the stiffness of his body was all about taking a preemptive approach. The immediate aftermath of a breakthrough in metal body would leave the metal essence he had absorbed in a very malleable state. While it was like this, it was the best time to lay the foundation for a more flexible body. Thankfully, Lionel realized this issue early on, or else he might have great problems to deal with later down the line. Not wasting any more time, Lionel opened the technique library. This was a second benefit of using a training room in Valiant Hall. Members of Valiant Hall had access to the techniques of all peaks as long as they paid for it with merit points. Though the price here was more expensive than if Lionel went to each individual peak. It was once again matchless in convenience. Lionel soon found what he was looking for. And not long later he used the help of the dictionary to decide what the best choice was. However, his face couldn't help but twist when he realized what it was. He really wanted to cry tears but had none to shed. His hand hovered above the screen, twitching. 108 Rising Suns. Chapter 722. Lionel closed his eyes as he pressed the accept prompt. He felt as though he was losing a portion of his innocence forever. No matter what, he couldn't let Aina know about this or he wouldn't ever be able to live it down. Everything only got worse after the technique was projected to Lionel. As one might expect, 108 Rising Suns had exactly 108 positions, all curated to ensure that a sun did indeed rise. The issue with all of this was that Lionel would have to be the one to complete all of them. Fuck it. It's not like there's anyone here to see this anyway. So Lionel began. With the help of the training room, not only was the technique projected to him, but there was even a live model to follow. At the very least, watching the model going into such poses was far better than watching Lionel himself do it. The poses began innocent enough. The first few were nothing but normal stretches. What was special about them would be the fashion by which force was circulated and used to supplement these positions. Due to this special use of force, Lionel found himself sweating just by trying to touch his toes or twist his back. Things only got progressively worse from there. By the end of it, Lionel was folded into a pretzel, his ass sticking up high into the air and his face flushed completely red, soaked through completely with sweat. The good news was that by the time he got to pose 108, he was far too tired to even consider how embarrassing his poses were. The bad news, however, was more of the same. He might have to kill anyone who saw him like this. Lionel collapsed into a starfish position, his lungs gasping for breath. How could he have ever thought that an exercise created for the sake of sex would be so grueling? Was sex this demanding? Lionel shivered. At that moment, Lionel realized something quite uncomfortable. He looked below only to see that a certain rod was standing completely at attention. Damn it. It seemed that the use of force wasn't so innocent after all. This damned exercise was meant to stimulate him like this? Lionel looked up at the ceiling, his dick throbbing and no Aina in sight. It was then that he realized, according to the dictionary, he had to do this twice a day for at least a month to get the lasting results he wanted. In fact, he would have to maintain this regimen for as long as he was in the fourth dimension, as he would likely have to find another for the fifth. Is this what they meant by absolute power corrupts absolutely? I haven't even gotten to absolute power yet, though. Several dozen minutes later, Lionel's loins finally managed to calm their fire. Of course, a harsh and cold shower helped volumes with this. Luckily, this training room also had this available. After Lionel was finished, he ordered a meal and practically inhaled it all before getting back to his training. Now that this flexibility nonsense is out of the way for now, we can focus on what really matters. Lionel was quite excited for this. He felt that his body was lighter and more powerful and explosive than it had ever been. And that was just after one round of 108 rising suns. Now he was ready to put it into use. There were a few things Lionel wanted to do. For one, his spearmanship was far too basic. As of now, all of Lionel's attacks were of the simplest variety that might be taught to a child who had just entered a dojo. The only spear technique he had was Call of the Wind, but that was technically a modified archery technique. Ironically, he never used it with his bow. By now, Call of the Wind was too weak for Lionel to use in battle, so he never did. It was more worth it to use simple and straightforward attacks. But now he finally had the time and the funds to use real techniques. The truth was that Call of the Wind wasn't weak. It had be a C-grade reward, which made it about a tier 3 or 4 technique. Lionel could use it effectively even now. The main issue was that after modifying it into a spear technique, it became even weaker than that. And Lionel had a poor wind elemental affinity without Little Black Star by his side, so he found it to be more of a hindrance than anything to his marksmanship. What Lionel wanted to do now was clear, then. He wanted to look for a few spear techniques that would suit him and give him more powerful explosive strength. After he did this, he definitely needed to find a few bow techniques that suited him as well. As of now, he was only using the things he learned from Merlin's trial. And though they were good and quite many in number, they ultimately lacked the one-hit strength Lionel was looking for. If not for this, he wouldn't have been forced to run from the Oryx. Beyond this, Lionel would throw his focus into creating new mage arts around his metal body and mage core synergy. As for things like movement techniques, Lionel already had one he was very fond of and suited him perfectly. Even up to now, he still hadn't unearthed all of its potential. The final things Lionel thought he might as well look into would be styles and, maybe most importantly of all, Lionel wanted to see if Valiant Heart had any more resources that might help him understand how to utilize his Dream Force just that much better. As much as he seemed to despise Valiant Heart, if not for them, he would still be using normal Soul Force as opposed to the much more powerful Dream Force. Lionel felt it was about time he see through to the true potential of his Dream Force. With that thought, Lionel opened up a panel of spear techniques. Chapter 723. Lionel soon realized that these techniques got very expensive, very quickly. The yoga technique he had just bought only cost a few hundred merit points. But these tier 7 and higher spear techniques Lionel was looking through all cost several thousand at the cheapest. There also weren't a small number that could only be counted in the tens of thousands. However, if others could afford it, for Lionel, it was nothing more than a drop in the bucket. In fact, the only reason he was thinking of the expense now was because of Aina. She had never spoken about how expensive these places were to use, and Lionel was pretty certain that he had a good grasp on her merit point situation. I guess he'll just have to give her a bunch next time I see her. Lionel shook his head and began to focus. He not only needed a technique or maybe techniques that could fit in well with his affinities, but he also needed them to not clash while being used with a potentially two-headed spear. Lionel's most powerful weapon was his quasi-silver double-headed spear. It would be a shame if he was in a tough enough battle to be forced to bring it out, only to find out that he couldn't use it to its greatest potential. Immediately, Lionel eliminated all spear techniques that didn't align with his affinities. From what Lionel could see after this, there were many spear techniques usable by those with fire elemental affinities. Almost too many. In contrast, there were only a handful that could be used with his light elemental affinities, and only 3 he found had star elemental affinities as their root. This made sense. After all, the rarer the affinity, the less likely one would be to find techniques for it, especially when you were looking for the use of a specific weapon. Not only this, but they also became many times more expensive. However, what was odd was that Lionel didn't find even one earth elemental technique. To put that into perspective, he did manage to find one space elemental spear technique. Is it difficult to make an earth elemental technique with the spear in mind? Out of curiosity, Lionel checked through all the earth elemental techniques Valiant Heart had, only to find that it wasn't just rare for the spear but for weapons in general. It seemed that it was difficult to translate the earth elemental into combat techniques if a weapon was involved. I see. Lionel made a mental note of this and moved on. The earth element wasn't known for its attack prowess to begin with, so Lionel had never expected to choose a technique with it in mind. The moment he had laid eyes on the space elemental spear technique, he knew he had to have it. Even though it cost 90,000 merit points, an amount that wasn't small even to him, it didn't matter. Lionel knew that it was the perfect technique for his double-sided spear. If used in conjunction with his divine armor, he could truly be undefeatable, especially on a battlefield. Without hesitation, Lionel snatched it, adding Vanishing Blade to his arsenal. Then he turned his attention to the light, fire and star elemental techniques. From the light, he chose a technique worth 30,000 merit points called Harmonic Spear. From the fire, he chose two techniques worth 17,000 merit points combined called Infernal Cyclone and Meteoric Impact. As for star elemental techniques, Lionel decided that of those available, none suited his style very well. He believed that Meteoric Impact, Infernal Cyclone, Harmonic Spear, and Vanishing Blade would all synergize very well and flow immaculately in battle. However, the star elemental techniques were all focused on heft and weight. In Lionel's opinion, the star element was about more than just its weight. However, these techniques were rather crude despite how expensive they were. If Lionel ever wanted a star elemental spear technique, he would either have to make one of his own, or join an organization with better spear techniques than Valiant Heart. Lionel took a deep breath. With a thought, a gorgeous silver spear appeared in his palms. The moment it did, it was as though it wanted to fight against Lionel, causing him to grin. "You're quite arrogant for a spear. But you fighting against me like this is exactly the training I need right now. Keep going." The double-headed spear was 3 meters long, dwarfing Lionel in size. Though at the moment it was impossible to see with the naked eye, Lionel knew well from just a touch that it had the capability to split into 3 segments. Let's begin with the foundation. Meteoric Impact. Lionel held the trembling silver spear out with one arm, watching the motions of the live model with an intent gaze. There wasn't a single twitch of the muscle or shift of force that he missed. Without leaving out a single detail, he reflected it in his dream world. Lionel split his mind 30 ways, having had even more improvement recently. He assigned each to a crucial point of his body, having it entirely focus on reflecting the technique to absolute perfection. Then, using his infallible memory, he etched the feeling into his very being. Meteoric Impact was split into 4 stages of mastery. The first was the large rock stage. The second was the small rock stage. The third was the sand stage. And the final was the ash stage. This technique was all about focusing explosive firepower into the very tip of one's spear. By following this unique flow and making use of perfect timing, one would be able to unleash an explosive assault capable of doing devastating harm. Without Lionel having to say anything, the training room understood his need and manifested the forms of several large rocks. With an explosive step, Lionel erupted forward, his spear streaking forward like a piercing meteor. On its tip, a whistling shield of flames flickered. Bang! The spear tip collided with the massive rock before him. In one moment, the rock trembled, and in the next, it shattered, exploding outside into numerous tiny shards. In his first attempt, with a spear that didn't want to listen to him, Lionel immediately crossed the large rock stage and entered the small rock stage in a Tier 7 technique. Chapter 724. You really don't want to listen, huh? Lionel chuckled as he looked down at the spear in his hand. If the elders of Valiant Heart knew he had such a treasure, who knows how they'd react. They'd probably, rightfully, get a bunch of satisfaction out of the fact Lionel couldn't control it very well. By Lionel's estimation, if not for his spear fighting back against him, he would have been at the sand stage at worst, destroying the rock into fine dust particles. Unfortunately, he didn't manage to reach that threshold. But Lionel was fine with this. Mastering these techniques posed little to no difficulty for him. He hardly had to try, he just needed to perfectly copy what he saw before him and use his ability to replicate it. If he wanted, it would take no more than 2 or 3 strikes to reach the ash stage. Without his spear fighting back, it would almost be too easy. Of course, Lionel had this training room to thank for this. At the same time, he got the idea for a new ability. Just then, he had decided to split his mind across his body on a whim, just trying to make sure the technique was fine-tuned. But he hadn't expected the feeling of absolute control it gave him. In that moment, Lionel felt that even if he wanted to control how fast his heart beat, he could do it. I'll store this at the back of my mind. I'm sure there are many potential applications. Though Lionel thought this nonchalantly, what if there was one day he could split his mind trillions upon trillions of ways, allowing him to fine-tune every cell of his body? Of course, Lionel didn't even know if such a thing was possible. He was already at the peak of the 4th dimension with his mind, and though he was still incrementally becoming stronger in this aspect even without breaking through, there couldn't be much more room for growth, right? Lionel shook his head and focused once again. A wheel of fire whistled through the room. Lionel's hands passed over one another, his twin-bladed spear shifting from side to side as it spun at impossible speeds. Sweat beaded down Lionel's face, but the cold look in his seemed to freeze the air. Shuu, rolling wheels of fire shot out from Lionel's spear, rolling along the ground like death traps bearing down on an enemy. They smashed everything in their path to the ground, exploding them into fine dust upon contact. Lionel spun his spear around his waist, the speed of its spin accelerating as an arc of fire shot through the air. It looked as though a wheel of flame followed every spin, encasing Lionel in a gyroscope of endless red-black flames. Explode, explode, explode. Every rock Lionel came up against was immediately blasted apart, sending bits and pieces pelting around the room. The strength of infernal cyclone was undeniable, and it was more relentless than meteoric impact, albeit much more difficult to control. But this was to be expected for a Tier 8 black treasure. Infernal cyclone was built on the back of this wide sweeping and spinning spear technique. It only became more potent when two blades as opposed to just one were involved, making it perfect. Of course, it was much better when there were multiple enemies to face, but this was exactly why Lionel hadn't chosen it as his only technique. In terms of stages, Infernal Cyclone didn't have any. Rather, it had move stances. These were broken down into the forward spin and reverse spin, which could be broken down into many iterations that didn't need to be explained. What was important, though, was that when mastered to a certain degree, these wheels of flames could jet out from the spear, leaving devastation in their wake. This was considered to be the ultimate form of mastery for Infernal Cyclone, and one Lionel was still having trouble controlling. His accuracy was a bit off, and the wheels weren't as compact and powerful as he would like. But he felt like he would grasp it soon. Lionel took deep, heavy breaths. A strong golden light resonated around him, making him seem particularly holy as his hair danced about. Lionel swept his spear forward. His actions seemed to be particularly slow. Yet, somehow, his spear left afterimages in its wake. These afterimages were so clear that they almost appeared to be the real thing. Lionel shifted his feet, sweeping his spear backward and using its second blade to pierce forward. The images layered atop of one another, making it seem as though Lionel's blade was twice as long as it truly was. This was the harmonic spear technique. It emphasized two things: speed and trickery. The afterimages were so clear because Lionel was using his light elemental force to reflect perfect images of his spear. At this level of mastery, they became so clear that they were almost indistinguishable from the real blade. When this illusion was layered with the speed of the technique, it made Lionel look as though he was moving slower than he really was. In battle, this trick of the eye would prove to be deadly. While one might think that Lionel was still a meter from them. Bang! Another rock shattered. But this time, the result was so devastating that the dust didn't settle quickly. Rather, what looked like black snowflakes slowly drifted to the ground, making it look like some eerie winter wonderland. When supplemented with light elemental force, Lionel felt that his spearmanship was more than twice as fast as usual, more than 3 times in fact. With Harmonic Spear, he felt like a god amongst men. Harmonic Spear was also formed into stages. But unlike the others, it didn't have a cap. It was entirely dependent on the number of afterimages you could sustain at once. Though Lionel felt like sustaining dozens wasn't a problem for him. He felt that it wouldn't be useful. 9 was about optimal for the opponents he would be calling enemy very soon. Once he managed to integrate these 3 spear techniques into one, and then layered Vanishing Blade on top of them, even Lionel anticipated the kind of strength he would be able to display. Chapter 725. An arrow streaked across the training room. Exploding pockets of air hovered like a halo around it for just a moment before it shot by. If one looked closely, though, this arrow seemed to be far too large to have been shot out of the bow of a normal human. It was encased in a force that made its weight and substance far more substantial. The moment it impacted against the opposite wall, tearing a path through several prepared stones, the training room shook and quaked. Lionel slowly put his bow away. He had put this room through a lot in the past several days. He was surprised it hadn't collapsed yet. Of course, he had no intention of holding back. After everything Valiant Heart had put him through, maybe destroying a few training rooms would be the best way for him to get some payback. Shaking his head, Lionel began his second round of yoga for the day. Lionel was very surprised by how much these yoga poses were helping him. Without exaggeration, if he had to pick the single best technique he had learned during this partial seclusion, it would be 108 Rising Suns. It wasn't the most powerful, obviously, and it couldn't be applied directly in battle. But the benefits it gave to Lionel as a whole couldn't be understated. Lionel felt that his coordination was through the roof. At the same time, his speed and even his strength had taken a tick up. The more limber his body became, the less work Lionel had to put in to fight against its limitations, and thus the more direct and efficient strength he could apply. From Lionel's estimation, a small tick-up in flexibility caused sweeping changes through his body, especially since Lionel was a person with high levels of coordination to begin with. All of this should have made Lionel very happy. But the reality was the opposite of this. Of course, this unhappiness had nothing to do with the embarrassment of the poses. Lionel had long since gotten over that. Rather, much more seriously, it put a big problem of Lionel's into perspective. This time, Lionel had been able to pick out a facet he could improve in and fix it. However, what about next time? Lionel wasn't Aina, who had an intuition about how to best train her body. Lionel had to deduce and often guess at everything. Never in his wildest dreams did Lionel believe just adding some flexibility to his body would cause such wide, sweeping changes. This led to Lionel being stifled by a fear of missing out. What if there was some other simple method he hadn't quite grasped just yet? What if there was some important training method he should be starting now to set a foundation for the future he was completely unaware of? Towards such a thing, Lionel could only sigh. Dedicating one of his split minds to always pay attention to his Bodhi state was about the best he could do in the regard. Finishing up his exercises, Lionel took another cold shower and engulfed an entire family's worth of food before turning his attention back to the control panel. At this point, Lionel was quite satisfied with his gains. He had learned 4 spear techniques, 1 excellent bow technique, and he even had the framework for several new mage arts being configured and tested in his dream world even right now. For now, Lionel decided against choosing a style. After looking through all of them, Lionel didn't find any that were truly worth it. Though those styles seemed extremely powerful when he first learned of them in Brave City, months removed, Lionel realized that they weren't much different from parlor tricks. Lionel found that shifting his state of mind to use these styles was a hindrance to his optimal battle state. And splitting his mind to maintain them would still, likewise, be hindering his best self. Lionel was a cold and calculating warrior. He meticulously broke down his movements and that of his opponents into countless numbers a very rare few could understand. However, none of these styles were quite like that. And those that were seemed like cheap knockoffs of something Lionel could do on his own better. So, Lionel ignored styles for now, deeming them to be a waste of time. Instead, he turned his attention to everything Valiant Heart had on Dream Force, his eyes lighting with excitement. If this went well, he might very well be able to bring his ability to a new level. What was unique about Dream Force that set it apart from every other force type was in the fact every living thing with a consciousness had it. It might have appeared in very small quantities in most people, but that didn't change this fact. What made those with Dream Force affinity special was that they were able to use this unique force in large quantities. These individuals could be considered to be hyper-aware. They had minds that worked on a different level than everyone else. When Lionel began to delve into the world, he truly began to learn something new. Within the dimensional verse, abilities weren't as random as Lionel once thought. Though there were always instances of unique, uncharted abilities popping up here and there, most abilities could be separated into defined categories and graded in very specific ways. This grading system was known as the Ability Index and it was widely accepted. It was likely due to a comprehension of the Ability Index that Arte was so easily able to decipher that Lionel had a sensory type ability. For example, take for instance the Ability Index of telekinetic individuals. These people were separated into 4 categories based on the strength of their ability. The first level was called Control. The second level was called Strength. The third level was called Amplification. And the fourth and last level was known as Sublimation. There were countless individuals born with telekinetic abilities, but most of them fell into the weakest control category. As one might expect then, those with Dream Force-related abilities also had their own ability index and were likewise separated by strength. Chapter 726. Lionel's eyes brightened. This sort of systematic categorization was exactly what he was missing. Lionel had long since abandoned his stat reading habit because it would often throw him off in the midst of battle. Without understanding a person's lineage factor or ability, doing something like reading their stats would only handicap himself. But this ability index was a completely different story. If he could grasp an understanding of it, Lionel smiled, making a decision to memorize the entire ability index when he had the time. But first he would have to focus on himself. Lionel turned his attention to Dream Force. The first level, Opening. The second level, awakening. The third level, visualization. The fourth level, control. The fifth level, manifestation. The fifth level in particular had a red underline, causing Lionel to sigh. The reason this ability index existed was obvious. But it was also a guide to follow on how to improve one's ability and what path to follow. In a lot of ways, Lionel wished he had known about this ability index long ago. The issue was, according to the legend, this red underline meant that this evolution was impossible to reach unless one was directly born with it. It was an ability almost exclusively awakened by savants and no one else. Obviously, Lionel wasn't even close to touching this fifth level and he never would. That said, he could remember a certain savant who had done exactly that. Lionel shook his head. The first level, opening, was a subtle awakening of dream force. This gave one added thinking capacity, greater memory, faster thinking speed and higher intellect. This was considered to be the lowest level. The second level, known as awakening, was a level where the user was more aware of the existence of their dream force. This allowed them everything gained on the first level but with an added sensory perception. This was also the minimum requirement necessary to absorb and utilize dream force actively. The third level, visualization, allowed one to utilize dream force to recreate objects in one's mind and simulate reality. This was where consciousness became almost tangible and real, allowing one to control vivid dreams to insanely high levels of detail. The fourth level, control, went beyond this. At the lowest level, it allowed one to control one's mind and sensory perception, raising it and dulling it as one pleased. At the highest level, one could take hold of their consciousness to manipulate every aspect of their body even to the smallest level. The fifth level, of course, didn't need to be explained. Within each of these levels, one could be given 3 grades of proficiency. If Lionel had to grade himself, he believed himself to be at 3rd grade of the visualization level. In fact, he believed that he had taken a half step into the control level. This ability index really put things into perspective. There were always those out there who were better. Lionel seemed to be running through all the talents no matter where he landed, but wasn't that only natural? This was a mere 5th-dimensional world whereas his father, at the very least, was from a 7th-dimensional world. If Lionel really wanted to see where he measured up, he would need to first face geniuses from those high-level worlds. If he came out unscathed, only then would he be able to hold his head up high. As of now, Lionel was just bullying those who had a much lower starting platform than he did. The ability index is adjusted depending on where you can display your optimal strength. Obviously, any 7th-dimensional existence would be able to display their ability's highest level on a 4th-dimensional world. But whether they could do the same on a 7th-dimensional world was a completely different matter. Right now, Lionel's ability was considered to be in the peak of the 5th dimension. However, it was only being fueled by 4th-dimensional dream force and his 3rd-dimensional existence. The deeper Lionel read, the more he realized that it seemed he had underestimated himself. Lionel had mistakenly believed that since his ability was in the 5th dimension, it was thus already at a 5th-dimensional standard. As such, the fact he could visualize 5th-dimensional matters was normal. However, he was wrong. Very wrong. The foundation for everything was which dimension you were in. By still being in the 3rd dimension, Lionel was handicapping his own ability by unfathomable levels. This was a difficult concept to understand. After all, Lionel's mind and body were both in the 4th dimension. His ability was even in the 5th dimension while the dream force he used was in the 4th dimension. So what exactly was the issue? The difference here was that crossing into dimensions wasn't a power-up. It was a fundamental change of a person on a molecular level. The simplest and boldest way to put it was that you were ascending into godhood. Quite literally, to those in a lower dimension than yourself, you were nothing less than a god. Lionel was unable to undergo this complete transformation until he stepped out of the 3rd dimension. Unfortunately, he couldn't without the later portion of dimensional cleanse. The truth was that the only reason Lionel was able to step into higher dimensions and other facets was as a result of his talent. His potential was much higher than his current level, so the bottlenecks that would have existed for someone else simply didn't exist for him. But none of this changed the fact that his overall abilities were all weighed down by a massive 3rd-dimensional anchor. This was all to say one thing. The fact that Lionel could exhibit the 4th level, control, in his current state, even while being in the 5th-dimensional world that should have suppressed him, made him nothing short of a monster. I see. Lionel came to a realization. This was why his split minds kept increasing. He had never reached a cap to begin with, and maybe the only reason he was struggling so much with simulating his enemies was because of this same reason. Lionel's understanding of his own ability took a massive leap forward. In that case, what information do you have on using and manipulating Dream Force? Chapter 727. Lionel began to very seriously go through all the information Valiant Heart had on Dream Force. To his surprise, there was quite some amount of it. But Lionel quickly realized how. Among all the abilities one could run into in battle, and as devastating as many could be, maybe the most feared one were all related to Dream Force. Matters related to consciousness were among the most enigmatic in all of existence. To face someone who could seemingly control it was daunting. As such, the amount of information here had less to do with Valiant Heart's prowess, and was more reflective of the dimensional versus focus as a whole. This much made sense though. The ability index Lionel attached to himself was the sensory Dream Force type. However, there were still many others. For these others, all of them ended with the very same red underline manifestation level, but the first 4 and something 3 or 2 levels greatly differed. For example, there was an illusion Dream Force type. These individuals were excellent at using tricks of the mind and thrusting others into their fabricated worlds. It was safe to say that no one wanted to run into such a person in battle. Even among the very first things Lionel learned, he was floored. Dream Force is a type of soul force. Yet all this time I've been treating it just like any other force. Lionel almost felt like kicking himself. It was such a simple shift in ideology, but it was important enough to flip the table of his understanding. What was the difference between force and soul force? Well, the simplest difference was intangibility. Force could apply change into one's surroundings at a whim. For example, Lionel could directly strengthen his body with his force. Likewise, his force-strengthening deviations could be directly applied to the environment as well. When Lionel used his light elemental force, his legs were directly enveloped by it. When he used his Scarlet Star force, his organs were charred by it. When Lionel activated his metal body, his body was directly strengthened by it. These were all abilities that encompassed force. What about soul force though? If Lionel wanted to make use of soul force, usually he needed a medium. This medium usually came in the form of a force art, just like the mages of Camelot. In Camelot, one needed to use their spirit pressure to execute their mage arts. This so-called spirit pressure was exactly the same soul force being mentioned of here. It didn't become possible for me to use mage abilities with any sort of fluidity in the absence of mage arts until Lionel's body froze. He almost couldn't stop himself from trembling all over. The current Lionel could bend the elements to his will with nothing more than a single thought. His body itself had become a perfect medium for this. However, the only reason it was possible was because he had formed his mage core. In the past, Lionel could still forcefully manipulate the elements without his mage core, but the strength he could display then wasn't even a tenth of what he could now. And even then, his magic was still the most powerful only when he used mage arts in conjunction with his mage core. It all suddenly hit Lionel like a ton of bricks. All this time he had been applying his Dream Force just like any other force. But what he had been doing was the equivalent of manipulating the elements without mage arts and without a mage core. Lionel really didn't know what to say to his own stupidity. Not only was he handicapping his Dream Force, but he was handicapping his magic as well. Right now, Lionel had 3 stars rotating within his ethereal Glabella's world. These 3 stars continuously purified normal force for him. However, what it converted it into wasn't Dream Force, but rather normal soul force. Lionel had been subconsciously splitting this soul force into 2 streams. One remained intact for the sake of casting his spells, manipulating his mage core and bending the elements to his will. The second portion was sent to his dream world and was then catalyzed into Dream Force by himself. All this time he had been treating Dream Force like just another element he could conjure up with his soul force. Idiot. I can't let Dad know about this or else he'll never hear the end of it. Lionel felt like he was doing a math proof for 1 + 1 is equal to 2, but the first line he started with was already 1 + 1 is equal to 2. He went through all those laborsome steps just to prove nothing. It was mildly infuriating. Without hesitation, Lionel suddenly took a massive step. He flooded all of his Dream Force toward his 3 stars. Bang! Lionel's mind went blank. It felt as though an explosion had gone off in his mind, ripping his consciousness to shreds. However, oddly enough, he felt not a single ounce of pain. It wouldn't be until long later that Lionel realized the true strength of the 3-star constitution. However, what he knew for sure now was that Star Force wasn't only exceptionally heavy, it was also very good at using this weight of its to purify. All this time, silently churning away at the atmosphere's force to turn it into Lionel's soul force, it never stopped, it never deviated, it never slowed, at this moment though suddenly being flooded with dream force that rapidly catalyzed its very core into the highest level of soul force in existence. Finally evolved. The slight diamond blue color of the 3 stars became more prominent. Its pure white was peeled back to reveal a heart-tingling blue that sparkled like the most gorgeous of crystals. The mist that hung around Lionel's ethereal glabella gained this gentle blue hue as well. It especially enveloped the roots of the mage core, causing its small budding form to suddenly grow. From a size of just over 6 inches, the mage core shot up, soon soaring to over 2 meters in height. Its petals gently swayed in the turbulence, now being several feet across each. Chapter 728. Lionel's eyes shot open, his body leaping upward out of his control. Blinding golden lights enveloped him completely, almost as though light elemental force couldn't stop itself from flooding toward him. Bang! Lionel crashed against the ceiling, his face distorting and his nose nearly being flattened. With nothing to grab onto, Lionel fell back toward the ground. He tried to flip over to land on his feet, but he overcorrected, causing his body to spin more than 10 times even though he had been aiming for just once. It was safe to say that he completely screwed up the timing, resulting in him landing face first and his face being smashed into a flat patty once again. What the hell? At this point, Lionel was far too scared to move, so he remained deathly still until he could understand what happened. It took a moment, but after simulating everything with his infallible memory that had seemingly gotten even sharper, he finally understood. Since Lionel was still in the 3rd dimension, his Bota strength was still lacking, especially in comparison to the white and blue belts he had to fight. Though his mind could keep up, his body often couldn't. In order to compensate, Lionel almost always had his speed branch lineage factor activated, just to different degrees depending on the situation. This allowed him to make up for his weaknesses. His speed branch allowed him to make use of light elemental force in his surroundings to boost his speed exponentially. This benefit only became greater after forming his mage core. But just now, way too much light elemental force had come, causing him to overcorrect by a larger margin than he was ready for. The reason was simple enough, but the cause of it? This was what was truly baffling. With just a sweep of his body, Lionel realized many changes. His 3 stars now produced dream force directly and seemed to have grown tenfold. To account for their explosive increase, the space within Lionel's ethereal glabella had also expanded massively. My internal sight's range has gone from a few hundred meters to over 10 kilometers even in a 5th-dimensional world. My mage core grew by more than 10 times. My mind can split more than 60 ways now. My magic is easily 10 times more powerful. Lionel was at a complete loss. Just a weeks ago he had been worried about this exact thing. He had almost missed out on the benefits flexibility could have brought him. And right here, there was a more than 10-fold increase to his strength that had been sitting here untouched all this time. As the purest and highest form of soul force Dream Force was ideal for the usage of Camelot's magic system. The force arts Lionel drew with it, even without changing a single symbol, were immediately several times more powerful. At this point, Lionel felt confident in healing his coach back to full health right this moment. If it wasn't because he wasn't certain of how to send the old man back to Earth, he would have already. Lionel finally managed to get a comprehensive understanding of his strength and sat up without being blown toward the ceiling. He looked down at his hands, shaking his head. How many more things was he missing out on? Just from a slight shift in philosophy, he had gained so much strength. How many other thoughts of his was wrong? In the end, Lionel's frown vanished, his gaze sharpening. Lamenting over this was a waste of time. He wasn't that kind of person. Since he realized how valuable knowledge was in this world, he would just have to swallow up as much of it as he could. He would strip Valiant Heart of all the information he had before he inevitably left this place. The days continued to tick by. As promised, Aina did indeed come to visit Lionel once a week. But this only made her feel more at a loss. Aina was very sensitive to Lionel's increase in strength. He seemed to be like a fish in water whenever it came to matters of training. She had only left him for a week, but he had grown so powerful so suddenly that she couldn't see where his limits lay. It was difficult for her to wrap her head around it. The feelings she had were quite conflicting, though. That day in the Jones Zone when she said she didn't want Lionel to change, she meant it. Maybe this was just how the complex mind of a woman worked. On one hand, she had been berating Lionel for being too adverse to killing and too lenient with his enemies. But, on the other hand, that cheerful boy who always had a smile on his face wasn't a version of Lionel she wanted to lose. She had lost too many people already. She hardly wanted to open up to Lionel at all in the beginning, and this was a large reason why. And maybe it was still a reason. She didn't know what she would do if she ever had to lose Lionel too. Seeing Lionel grow by leaps and bounds, the hooks of the dimensional verse sinking further and further in, Aina didn't know how she should feel. Should she feel happy that her boyfriend was growing more powerful? Or should she try to shelter him away as much as possible, hiding him from this cruel world? The emotions tugged and pulled at her from every direction. But without an answer, she could only bury it deep, not much unlike she always did. She smiled as she watched Lionel happily eat away at her food, keeping those complicated emotions locked away. On this day, the day of the selection had finally come. Having been moved up by several months due to the times of turmoil, it held much less fanfare than it once had in the past. The other organizations that would often come to keep an eye on the next generation of valiant heart were somewhat strikingly missing, leaving only internal members. It was under this half-festive, half-somber atmosphere that Lionel and Aina arrived. Chapter 729. Lionel held onto Aina's small hand as they walked forward. This was the second time that Lionel had been to this open arena. The first time he had been forced to step in to save Sale. This time, however, he would take center stage. The participating members were mostly white belts and blue belts. Though there were some black belts that wanted to try their luck, they were mostly here for experience and nothing else. The members of Polished Glass weren't too keen on joining. They weren't confident in their combat prowess and were focused on their crafting. With all the knowledge Lionel had taught them over the past several weeks, they felt like they had enough to study for a lifetime. None of this was too surprising by Lionel's estimation. What was, though, was the fact that Radlease was among these participating black belts. The pale-skinned and lanky jokester had disappeared from Polished Glass for a long while. But at this moment, Lionel could see him up ahead, registering himself for the selection. The result made Lionel's brows arch upward. It had to be known that much like Aina and Lionel, Radlease had only been here for about 3 months. A part of Lionel wanted to dismiss this as Radlease being like the other black belts, simply looking to gain experience. But for some reason, Lionel didn't feel this way. In order to join the selection, one needed to accumulate a certain amount of merits. Though the black belts that had been here for years could just barely scrap together such an amount, what about Radlease, who had only been here for such a short time? Interesting. Radlease, seemingly sensing Lionel's gaze, turned his neck and gave him a wide grin before walking off with his registration plaque. Not long later, it was Lionel and Aina's turn. To their surprise, though, the one handling these registration affairs was a familiar old lady. "Hello, Elder Magneral," Lionel said with a warm smile. The old lady snorted, clearly still not liking the shape of Lionel's face. The fact he was smiling now only made her feel even worse. And he just had to still be holding her precious student's hand in public like this, right in front of her, no less. Over the past month, Aina hadn't come to the lab even a single time. Magneral knew that she had done nothing but train and train. Seeing such a talent waste away their potential like this truly made her intestines feel as though they were being twisted. At this point, though, Magneral could only obediently register the couple. "Break a leg," she said while giving Lionel a fake smile. "Sure. But it won't be mine." Lionel's casual response made Magneral freeze. In the end, she just sneered. She had no idea where this brat got his confidence from. Ahem. Magneral frowned. She had hardly finished her thought when she realized something. Was he wearing white? Lionel and Aina found a seat amongst the competitors. Ironically, this was the same place Lionel had been forced to sit as a freshman before. This time, though, sitting on the ground floor, he felt as though his vision was far wider. "Are you nervous?" Lionel asked. "Nervous?" Aina was stunned by the question. Lionel laughed, seeing how baffled she was. "I guess the answer to that is no." Aina shook her head, realizing that Lionel was just trying to tease her. Was she nervous? Of course not. If there was anything she was feeling, it was a hope that these battles wouldn't be too easy, or else there wouldn't be much of a point. Unfortunately, though, there were many seeded participants who already had their entries locked in. The rest of them were essentially fighting for the remaining 4 spots. Lionel was probably the most disappointed by this, though. He had waited long enough to teach Hephaestus a lesson, only to find out that the latter didn't even have to participate. In fact, he was probably not even in attendance today. Still, these seated positions hadn't been monopolized by Hero Peak. Even they couldn't get away with something like that. From Lionel's understanding, there were 8 spots already taken. 2 for the Hero faction. 2 for the Bear Rose faction. 2 for the Severed Heart faction. The last two were listed as miscellaneous, but considering one of them was Sale, Lionel assumed that these two were reserved for the former Valiant Hall members. Compared to the idle chatter of the two, the atmosphere hovering around the rest was quite heavy. The time continued to tick by until the final individual was registered and the elders convened a small meeting. Finally, Magneral stepped forward to explain, standing on the very podium Raylion had used to flip Valiant Heart Mountain on its head. However, the message she disseminated was simpler and far less contentious. At least in the beginning. The rules for this selection will be simple and straightforward. Today we will open up 4 battle platforms. The selection will begin when the sun officially rises and will end when the sun officially sets. Whichever 4 manage to hold on to the very end will be given the 4 remaining spots to enter the Valiant Heart Zone. Each participant will have unlimited challenges. However, this comes with its own set of rules. First, you cannot challenge a platform defender more than once unless said defender loses and reclaims their spot. Only then can you challenge this individual a second time. Second, you can only challenge once every half hour. Third, a defender is allowed 10 minutes of rest between every challenge. Fourth, a defender that has failed to defend 3 times will no longer be allowed to challenge. Now, the rules of challenges aside, this selection will be unlike the past. Valiant Heart is currently in the midst of struggle and what we need are warriors, not cowards. In the past there was a prohibition on crippling. This has been removed. There was a prohibition on killing. This has been removed. Those who join but fail to issue at least one challenge or defend a platform at least once, will be expelled from Valiant Heart. Those who want to withdraw, do so now or bear the consequences later. Many of the participants turned a deathly shade of pale. What was going on? When had the selection become like this? There was no surprise that many of the black belts that had come to test their luck immediately stood up and withdrew. In fact, from numbering in the hundreds, there weren't even 200 participants left after Magneral's words fell. The elders remained expressionless as they watched this scene. At this point, seeing the lack of backbone many of these students had, they felt that maybe Raylion had been correct. There were no shortage of elders dissatisfied with Raylion's approach, but seeing how much they were rotting from the inside out, it was hard to continue to fuel hatred for his methods. If things continued like this for too long and they continued to weaken with each successive generation, very soon, there wouldn't be any Valiant Heart Mountain left to be spoken of. Long before their enemies got to them, they would crumble from the inside. Magneral waited patiently until just about 180 were left. Finally, when it seemed like no one else was intent on leaving, Magneral nodded. Even though 180 was less than she had hoped for, it still wasn't to the point that they had no good seedlings left. Though she was certain that many of those who remained believed they could just concede quickly enough to not be harmed, this was still good enough for now. Maybe with Raylion's methods they'd soon breed even more warriors. On the ground below, Lionel didn't really feel much about the sudden allowance of killing. He had already deduced this much. He could see through Raylion's plan quite well. What he was surprised about, though, was that, once again, Radlease didn't show any signs of backing down. It was quite baffling indeed. Now we will begin. Magneral said coldly. 4 defenders, come forward. For every 10 minutes 4 defenders haven't been chosen. The quota for entry remaining will be sliced by 1. If you deem to waste all 40 minutes, not only will there be no spots remaining for the lot of you, but you will all be expelled. Everyone knew one would be at a disadvantage being amongst the first defenders and challengers, especially since everyone only got 3 chances to defend. However, if everyone wanted to hold back from taking a small loss, then everyone would lose. Surprisingly though, there was a couple that looked toward each other with knowing smiles. In a flash, Lionel and Aina shot forward. Before anyone could react, they had already taken 1 platform each, their aura steady and even somewhat overbearing. No one had expected for the first 2 defenders to appear to be a pair of white belts. And they definitely wouldn't have expected them to be white belts who had only just joined Valiant Heart. Chapter 730. Lionel took a deep breath. The subtle movement seemed to make force from the surrounding swarm toward him, making it seem as though his skin was twinkling with a subtle radiance. Aina silently held out her battle axe, her expression hidden behind her mask. She didn't seem to prepare anything, but her aura was as steady and unmoving as a mountain. It was safe to say that no small amount of individuals were shocked by what they were witnessing. Though, eventually, it would be the white belts that would be forced forward by their seniors. No one had ever thought that it would be done willingly. Among the crowd of youths that remained, there were no doubt members of Bear Rose who locked onto Lionel immediately. Not only were there individuals from Bear Rose, but there were no small number of King of Or's faction members, including Seriath, within the crowd. For a moment the youths weren't entirely certain of what to do. The fact two had gone up willingly made them all feel as though the momentum had been snatched. If they continued to lay back and force others up, it might not be as beneficial to them as they had once thought. It was then that the ground quaked. One would have thought that such a thing was caused by an earthquake or maybe a huge explosion in the distance, but when their gazes swung over to the source, all that was found was a massive bear of a man slowly walking forward. The man stood at 2.5 meters tall. From top to bottom, he was covered in a thick rose gold plate armor. The chest plate of this armor had the image of a roaring bear on it that reminded Lionel a lot of King Arthur's white lion armor. The detail on the armor was so intricately laid that it looked far more like a display piece than a battle armor. It was hard to fathom that someone would take such a gorgeous craft to war. What was maybe most astonishing about this armor, though, was that far more than just one individual wore it. In fact, there were exactly 12, all of whom were wearing this elaborate art piece and completely concealing the organization's uniform. The design wasn't subtle in the slightest. To Lionel, it couldn't have been more obvious that these people were from Bear Rose. However, it was also very clear that this massive bear of a man wasn't walking forward for the sake of becoming a defender. His target was clear. As though to confirm this, just as the massive man was about to walk through the final line of waiting participants, his hands snatched outward with a surprising deftness and speed. Before anyone could react, the massive man had already taken 2 necks into his large palms. Then with one swift motion he threw them in an arc through the air. The dull sound of bone and flesh meeting stone resounded alongside groans of pain and confusion. But, unfortunately for these 2 randomly picked white belts, they already found themselves on the stage against their will. They looked around in dismay, even sending a glance back toward Elder Magneral for some help. But all they received in response was an indifferent glance and an icy cold sentence. Stepping down will forfeit one of your rights to defend. This simple string of words was like a bucket of ice water being poured over the heads of the both of them. The massive bear of a man continued to walk forward as though nothing had happened. He, much like anyone else who was relatively astute, was quite clear on the shift the elders and Valiant Heart were experiencing now. As important as strength and hierarchy was in the past, it had only become more so now. Who cared about small petty rules or the inconvenience of a few? As long as your fist was big enough, you could do as you pleased. Things were this simple and would only become simpler. Bang! With a small hop, the rose-gold armor-wearing giant landed heavily onto Lionel's platform. Even now, his face was obscured by a heavy helmet and visor. Despite the somewhat feminine color of his armor, it didn't seem to take away from his bloodthirsty aura in the slightest. Never did I think that the brat who dared to slap the face of my Bear Rose faction would choose to appear so soon. But this is good. This will be a memory impossible for others to forget. The hero faction isn't the only faction not to be trifled with. Lionel's lip twitched when he heard this. The hero faction was not meant to be trifled with? Did he think that Lionel had a bias for one against the other? If anything, the things Lionel had done to the hero faction were far worse. But, clearly, these Bear Rose faction members had only just come back from the frontline battle against the Oryx. They knew little of what happened in Valiant City during their absence. It made one wonder. With so many out on the front lines, why did it seem like Raylion and Hephaestus were always here? Of course, that might just be an illusion. After all, it wasn't like Lionel could bother to keep an eye on them all the time. It wasn't long before Lionel had removed all distracting thoughts in his mind. He stood just 20 or so meters away from the massive bear of a man, his expression placid. As things were now, this was the only challenge that had been issued. It was as though the entirety of the arena had fallen silent for the sake of observing this one battle. If you want to stand a chance, I advise you to take your armor off, Lionel said evenly. If not, this battle will end before you get a chance to do anything. The massive man snorted. My name is Dune. They'll be sure to engrave it onto your gravestone after you die so you don't forget what happened to you even on the other side. Bang. Dune launched himself forward, the stones beneath his feet cracking with fine lines. Chapter 731. Lionel shook his head, his gaze still indifferent. Just when Dune had reached his range, bearing down on him with a fist that sent a fiery blaze crackling through the air, Lionel took a subtle step forward. His one movement threw Dune's fist off course, causing it to whistle by his ear. Golden lights coated Lionel's body, his every movement being followed by a fluid arch of radiance that left a beautiful pattern in the air. Just by following it, one could see the subtle bobs and weaves of Lionel's figure, capturing the immaculate elegance of his simple movements. Lionel's hips sunk down. Enveloped by Dune's body, it seemed as though he would be swallowed whole by the giant. Yet, his fist twisted forward, a delicate spiral of light whistling in its path. Dune felt a heavy thud resonate through his rose-gold armor, but he sneered. Was that why Lionel was so confident? His speed? What good was speed when you couldn't break past his defense? However, it was then an audible crunch filled Dune's ears, causing his expression to change. He explosively retreated, his gaze, the only visible part of his face through his visor, contracting. Dune looked down at his armor, his face warping when he noticed the sheared metal on his torso. Not only had it distorted a portion of the bear's roaring face, but had it been just a bit deeper, it would have dug into his flesh, ripping past his chainmail and leaving him with severe injuries. What just happened? Wasn't it a simple punch? Dune had felt a subtle shift in Lionel's fist that let him know that Lionel was actually able to call upon the Four Seasons realm for his fist technique. But, with Lionel's tight control, it was difficult to tell what level he was at. Still, what was clear to Dune was that the power behind Lionel's punch still shouldn't have been enough to cause such a thing. Still don't want to take it off? Lionel asked evenly once again. Dune's expression warped as the crowd suddenly realized what had happened. In the first exchange, Lionel won. Everyone knew that though these armor-wearing Bear Rose members weren't in their uniforms, each and every one of them was a blue belt. Not only were they blue belts, they were elites among blue belts that had years of experience, decades even, in fighting the Oryx. In Lionel's estimation, the fact that Dune actually managed to come out unscathed from that exchange, outside of his distorted armor, of course, was enough to prove just how powerful he was. No normal blue belt would have come out without a hole blasted through their stomach. However, Lionel's words of kindness and his polite reminders seemed to only infuriate Dune further. At this point, if he truly took off his armor, wasn't he just conceding defeat? Dune began to laugh. The movement of his diaphragm and the displacement of his lungs were so exaggerated that his bellows seemed to cause claps in the air. Bang! Dune slammed his fists together, fiery crackles lighting the air and dancing like embers. I'm going to enjoy pummeling you into the ground. In that moment, the image of a harsh sun appeared above Dune's head, an expanse of endless sandy dunes appearing around him. The temperature of the surroundings seemed to skyrocket, beams of sunlight bouncing off Dune's reflective rose-gold armor. The expressions of the crowd changed. They all understood in an instant. This was Summer of the Four Seasons realm. Not only that, but it seemed more powerful than just that. There were no small number of people who chose to focus on just one of the seasons, priming and prepping it to a level that surpassed even some who had grasped all four. In some ways, these individuals also forged their own path, making their Four Seasons realm comprehension no weaker than one that had comprehended it all on their own. Of course, such individuals would always be a tick below a complete Four Seasons realm master. But they were not to be trifled with. Especially when Lionel already had to make use of the Four Seasons realm to close the gap between the fourth dimension and himself. Dune shot forward again. This time he was truly like a cannonball soaring through the air, fiery streaks of red leaving devastation in his path. He seemed to be unstoppable, an untouchable mass of fury. Lionel's cold, indifferent eyes meant Dune's fiery rage. He took another well-timed step forward, his movements as fluid as water. In fact, the light element that rippled around him seemed to respond exactly like waves in the ocean, his every movement sending a wave of changes within it. This time though, Dune was ready. His first fist was nothing more than a feint, his second was already prepared, hooking forward to smash toward the side of Lionel's head. Lionel didn't seem to be off-put by this. His fist and rolled shoulder protected the side of his face, a subtle shift in his footwork causing the blazing punch to barely glance off him. This glance should have been enough to char Lionel's body into ash, but the flames tickled off his skin, dancing about as though a fire spreading across glass. Standing within Dune's range, a blinding golden light enveloped Lionel's body. His fists exploded forward, a barrage of punches shooting through the air. Shoulder joint, visor, hip joint, elbow. Lionel's speed was so quick that Dune couldn't react. There was a lull in all the noise for just a moment before a consecutive flood of air-exploding fists seemed to land at once, leaving Dune's armor looking like the surface of a cratered moon. The sturdy rose-gold armor was twisted apart and shattered, piercing into the flesh beneath and ripping Dune's bone apart. Maybe if it wasn't for being a battle-hardened veteran, Dune would be crying out in pain. But, due to the regions Lionel had targeted, Dune couldn't even see the battlefield or his opponent. On top of that, he couldn't move his arms without a slicing pain shooting through his spine. He was finished. Lionel shook his head inwardly. First you wear a full armor of metal, then you use the element I fear the least. It's like you wanted to lose. Chapter 732. Lionel looked up. He was still in range of Dune's attack, but he was also very much aware that there was no way this big guy was moving. Every one of Lionel's punches had torn a rotating hole into his armor, sending bits of shrapnel into his body. The worst part about this shrapnel, though, was that it was still connected to the rose gold armor, making the situation even worse than it would otherwise be. If Dune wanted to move, he would not only be slicing apart his own limbs, but he would also have to fight against the sturdiness of his own armor. It could be said that fighting against Lionel while wearing a full suit of metal was probably the dumbest thing you could do. The use of the fire element wasn't even half as egregious as this alone. Lionel didn't know if the Morales family had any enemies, though he could guess that they probably did. No matter how powerful an organization was, it would always have its contenders. However, what Lionel didn't have to guess was that whoever these enemies were, there was no way they wore armor like this. Either they wouldn't wear metal armor at all, or they'd find a way to enchant the armor to stop those with metal synergy from manipulating it. Facing metal weapons was a different matter. Oftentimes, there would be force poured into it, disrupting Lionel's control. And the weapon would often be moving too fast for Lionel to deal with before he was harmed. But an armor like this was practically a stationary target. Simply put, Dune was asking to lose. Lionel reached forward, touching the now distorted bear on Dune's chest. He sighed, shaking his head. By all rights he should kill Dune. It was obvious that the latter wouldn't have shown him any mercy had he been on the other end. Was killing really a necessary extreme? All he had done was take a shop, right? He hadn't even killed any of their members. This dimensional verse was really too ridiculous. Lionel shoved his palm forward, deforming the rose gold bear until its original form could no longer be seen. Blood leaked out from Dune's helmet. From start to finish, he didn't say a word, not even for the sake of begging for mercy. Lionel could sense the rage-fueled gazes from the 11 remaining rose gold armor wearers. But none of them said a word either. It was clear that each of them were warriors that had seen a lot. Since they dared to act, they also dared to die. Maybe Valiant Heart isn't completely rotten yet. Lionel thought absent-mindedly. Lionel's palm squeezed into a fist. As though scrap aluminum, the chest plate on Dune crumpled. Lionel ripped downward, tearing the armor away from Dune's body. With a kick, he sent Dune's half-dead body out of the arena. Dune sputtered and coughed, looking up at the sky with hints of unwillingness. This wasn't because he was dying, but rather because he knew he would have had Lionel not just helped him take his armor off. Somehow, he had ended up being shown mercy. But it only filled him with a sense of endless humiliation. At that moment, many felt their minds going numb. If this was what Lionel could do to armor they were wearing, what were they supposed to do? Lionel looked down at the large piece of rose gold in his hand and tossed it to the side. Dune slowly rose on his own despite the state of his body, knowing that no one would come to get him. In fact, he didn't want anyone to. Without looking back, he dragged his body away, leaving a trail of blood in his wake. From start to finish, the remaining 11 didn't spare Dune a glance, each one of them staring down Lionel with murderous intentions. It was clear that all of them were waiting for the 10-minute timer to come to an end, each of them wanting nothing more than to rip him limb from limb. Within the silent crowd, Nigmir trembled hard. He, who had fought Lionel once before, knew for a fact that he wasn't this powerful before. Any thoughts he had of defeating him seemed to have gone out the window, his body drenched in a cold sweat. The members of the King of Or's faction watched on with clenched jaws. With such strength, were their plans of wearing Lionel down even viable? Nigmir's gaze flickered with rage, his eyes shifting from Lionel to Aina. He would get his revenge. He needed to get his revenge. No matter what. Nigmir's body flashed, a strong assault of wind whipping through the surroundings and catching many off guard. No small number of people were still trying to wrap their minds around what had just happened. No one thought that someone else would levy a challenge at this exact moment. Nigmir's body crossed over Lionel's platform as though in blatant provocation before landing heavily on Aina's. His mind was twisted with fury, causing the wind elemental force around him to respond in kind. Lionel frowned, his fingers twitching. A suffocating aura exuded from him. If it wasn't for the rules, he would have already attacked Nigmir right then and there. If it was a normal challenge against Aina, it wouldn't be a problem. But this was very clearly not that. Nigmir's body shook under Lionel's oppression. But he grit his teeth, his rage taking over his rational mind. He laughed into the skies. You just stand right there and watch. Nigmir shot forward, his speeds reaching mind-numbing levels. The wind enveloped him, an ivory armor manifesting and a 4-meter-long lance appearing in his hand. Die. Nigmir saw something flash by him. In that moment he felt as though the world had shifted, one side sliding up while the other slid downward. He couldn't wrap his mind around what happened until he plopped to the ground, his body split in two halves right down the middle. Another silence fell over the crowd as droplets of blood fell around a masked beauty with fluttering hair. Chapter 733. Aina stood with her back to Nigmir's fallen body. Though one couldn't see her face, the cold look one could see through the slits in her mask were enough to send shivers down one's spine. The contrast between Lionel and Aina was too drastic. There was no mercy, no hesitation, there wasn't even a small chance. The moment Nigmir showed such signs to her, she cut him down where he stood. At that moment Aina was pissed. She wasn't only pissed at the members of Bear Rose, she was pissed at Lionel too. He might think it was fine to forgive your enemies like this, but how was she supposed to react when a boorish brute who just tried to kill her man was let off so easily? It was always easiest for the victim to forgive, but what about those who cared for the victim? Was she supposed to let things go too? Aina felt that she was maybe too agitated, but the feeling was stifling. She didn't know how many times she had to tell Lionel to stop showing mercy like this. She didn't know when Head finally realized that a hint of mercy shown today could easily come back to bite him the next. It was infuriating to the point she didn't even want to look at him right now. If it wasn't for Nigmir coming in a timely fashion to give her something to vent on, she might have exploded already. The volatile feelings in her chest rampaged around. And now she had to wait 10 minutes for the next victim. Aina herself hated that she reacted so violently. She found it harder and harder to keep her cool when things were related to Lionel, a problem he ironically had the same issue with though toward her. But, compared to Lionel who only wanted to protect her, Aina found some of Lionel's actions deeply frustrating sometimes. She was fine with them saving all those freshmen because she knew it was a part of Lionel's larger scheme, a scheme that was working out perfectly now. But what was the point in sparing Senior Lou back then? And what about this Dune character? How much longer would he be like this? Damn it. Aina's amber eyes tinged with red. She reached out a hand and made a snatching motion toward Nigmir's corpse. What happened next left the crowd shivering. The two halves of Nigmir's corpse convulsed. In the next moment, all the blood that had been pooling shot toward a single point, forming into a ball of crimson that left Nigmir's corpse looking like nothing more than a mummified figure. But even that didn't last long. Soon after, what remained of Nigmir's body dispelled into the wind like ash, floating away like meaningless motes of dust. It was the kind of scene one would never forget in their lifetimes. The blood continued to float by Aina as though it had a mind of its own, hovering there and reflecting the now high sunlight. It acted as a silent reminder of the scene they had all just witnessed. Lionel's frown deepened. But in the end he could only sigh. As intense as his feelings were for Aina, he had yet to tell her that he loved her. Maybe it was because he didn't know what those words meant, or maybe it was because he still wasn't sure if he did. Up to now, their relationship had managed to jump over many hurdles. But the one that had yet to be cleared was ironically the very first one they faced. That day. The image of Aina's delicate, small hand piercing through the heart of another human being was forever imprinted into his very soul. He knew why she had done it. She was telling him that this was the person she was, the person that she had always been. The gentle, graceful young woman he had known in school was nothing but a mask she wore, both figuratively and literally. She killed Conrad that day not only to protect her friends, but to show him that the girl he thought he liked wasn't her at all. She took this action even though she knew it would alienate not only him, but her own close sisters as well. And it had worked. It sent him into a tailspin, one that he hadn't recovered from even now. Maybe he had only gotten better at ignoring it. Nothing more, nothing less. It was quite funny. It seemed that he was very good at doing exactly that, ignoring things. Even to this point he still didn't believe that he could stand to his grandfather's ideology without feeling as though his comprehension of the world was crumbling. All Lionel knew was that he liked Aina enough to ignore even such a blatant conflict, a core ideology that left them diametrically opposed. As though this wasn't enough, the deeper and deeper Aina fell for Lionel, and the closer they became, the more this bothered her. The more she cared for Lionel, the more she couldn't stand to lose him. In her mind, Lionel's softness was exactly a thing that could make such a situation happen. It was exactly that something that could cause this radiant sun before her, this man she adored so deeply, to vanish forever and never return. Lionel smiled somewhat bitterly. Since Aina was fine, he could only let things be and allow her to vent. However, now he was pissed as well. If it wasn't for the ways of that Ray Lion. If not for this valiant heart. If not for the way of this damned dimensional verse. If everything could be peaceful, if there simply was no conflict, would his Aina have to feel such conflicting emotions all the time? Lionel's jaw set, his arms crossing over his bare chest. He looked blankly into the distance, his aura becoming heavier and heavier. The stone beneath his feet snapped and whined, but he didn't seem to notice as his gaze flickered between various degrees of fury. At that moment, the stone platform shook as another red-gold armored warrior faced Lionel. This time when they met Lionel's gaze, it felt as though a wild beast had locked onto them. It felt as though Lionel wanted to see the whole world burn to ash. Flames that seemed reaped from the depths of purgatory erupted. Chapter 734. The clanging of metal sounded as the Bear Rose faction members stripped down from their armor. Piece after piece clanged to the ground, resounding throughout the quiet arena. It felt as though every action taken in during this selection had a deeper meaning, as though every battle should put them at their edge of their seats. Even the audience didn't understand why this was, but it still felt like the metal pieces were crashing against their hearts rather than the stone platform. Though the Bear Rose faction member didn't say a single word, the action of being forced to take off their armor was humiliation enough. It felt as though, simply by standing there, Lionel was smearing their faces. Compared to Dune, though, this Bear Rose faction member was far calmer. By the time he tossed off his helmet, revealing the expressionless visage within, the audience had already seen his battle-worn body through and through. Though this faction member was a level beneath Hephaestus in terms of muscle definition and fast twitch fibers, maybe even 2 or 3 levels, in fact, the strength his body was bursting with was undeniable. Even the scars that ran across him didn't detract, but rather added to this perceived strength, leaving those watching on holding their breaths. At that moment, there were many in the crowd who suddenly recognized the young man before Lionel. Quite ironically, this was a young man who had had a falling out with Hero Peak as well. But rather than not joining any peak like Lionel had, he rather chose to join the peak of their direct competitors. Those that knew him called him Jaren the Scythe, despite the fact he didn't wield a scythe at all. Lionel stood with his arms crossed across his chest, not moving an inch as he watched Jaren take his armor off. Even though the battle had technically started already, Lionel didn't seem to care. The stones beneath his feet began to ripple, beginning to glow a faint red. The last piece of Jaren's armor fell to the ground. His palm flipped over, revealing a katana of outrageous length and with a curve just as obscene. Even with Jaren's strength, he allowed it to rest on the stone before him, but the gentle action alone caused the blade to sink. Without even a touch, the stone was split in two, plunging the 4-meter-long curved blade into its depths. Lionel Morales, is it? Lionel didn't respond, his expression remaining placid. His heartbeat grew steady as a mountain, its every thump sending a surge of blood through his body. His veins and arteries hardly swayed beneath the pressure, their sturdy walls even facilitating faster movement. Lionel seemed to subconsciously control the strength of his heart, every pump reflecting his emotions. You have quite some potential for a new white belt. However, there are some lines you can't cross no matter how much potential you have. Vice Leader Abe Thor can't be here to deal with you personally for the slight of taking his family's heirloom, and quite frankly, can't be bothered to deal with you personally. I will be the one to send you on your way. Are you done? The platform suddenly quaked, sinking into the ground by a whole inch. The air seemed to collapse, fine ripples of space discharging in every direction. On first sight, it looked as though fine lines of black rain were falling through the arena. I'm getting really tired of this bullshit. Lionel spoke again, taking a single step forward. The quaking became more harsh, the ground groaned and whined. Are you all really so eager for me to kill you? Would it make you feel better if I put your heads on a pike? If I desecrated your corpses? If I pissed on your graves? Is that what you want? Jaren's hands trembled, his brows frowning slightly. His palms grew sweaty outside of his control, soaking the hilt of his katana through. The grip of the material became slippery. Lionel's voice seemed to rise up from an abyssal hell. The flames around him caused the air to crackle and pop, whatever moisture there had been being burned into nothingness. I asked you a question. Lionel's words hammered Jaren's heart. Jaren's lip trembled. His instincts screamed, frying his nerves. He felt as though he was facing an Oryx chief. Somehow, Lionel's body seemed to be 10 times larger than it truly was, engulfing his field of vision until he couldn't see anything else. At that moment, Jaren roared, his force erupting into a skyscraper of energy. He took a heavy step forward, pushing his fear down. He had seen too much on the battlefield, he had no intention of falling without fighting. He had his own pride. Arcs of lightning whipped around his body, his eyes lighting up with the same presence. He bolted forward, his body leaving streaks of crackling lightning in his wake. Jaren raised his sword, slashing down with a speed that was almost impossible to track. All much of the audience could see was an arch of flickering images, as though a fan of katanas was opening up in the path of his wing. At that moment, Lionel's palm flipped over, a flexible 4-meter-long spear appearing. With a flick of his wrist, the sound of metal meeting metal resounded through the ears of all in attendance. Jaren's pupils constricted. The tip of Lionel's spear balanced the edge of his blade effortlessly. In fact, he could very clearly see a chip in his long, curved katana. Kacha. Bang. An explosion of fire caused Jaren to freeze. He watched as a 2-meter length of his once 4-meter-long blade flipped into the air, spinning like a wheel of silver before piercing into the stone below like a hot knife through butter. The eyes of the spear masters in the crowd widened. Meteoric impact. Jaren looked at the half that remained of his katana, his mind completely blank. Chapter 735. It was no wonder the crowd was stunned. Meteoric impact was a Tier 7 technique. Just learning it in the first place was something only blue belts with months of training could accomplish. It was one of the most powerful and devastating techniques Valiant Heart had access to, period. But to not only use it, but to use it with such a precise delay and such fine control left those who wielded spears feeling at a loss. They had all seen it clearly. The spear and katana came into contact first. They even had time to see Lionel balance the tip of his spear on the katana's blade edge. Only then did meteoric impact activate. But wasn't this technique supposed to rely on momentum, speed, and explosiveness? How could you accomplish all those things if you took a pause? Lionel walked forward, the heat on his body leaving Jaren's body a blistering red. It was as though his presence alone just might burn the latter to ash, leaving him drifting in the wind no differently from Nightmare. Bang. A scorching foot was left imprinted onto Jaren's chest as he soared out of the arena. He twitched and writhed, his situation being even worse than Dune before. Lionel raised his spear, pointing toward the remaining 10 Bear Rose members. I don't need 10 minutes. Hurry up and get up here or else he'll come down to you. Space continued to bend and quake. Fine black lines rained down, making the knees of all those in Lionel's presence bend. Maybe the only one who seemed completely unaffected was Aina herself. But, somewhat ironically, it was because of her such a thing was happening to begin with. Lionel hadn't planned on unleashing his wrath in this way. But, at this moment, if he didn't vent, he felt like he really might implode. Bang. Lionel couldn't wait any longer. He shot off the platform, tearing a path toward the 10 Bear Rose members. Their eyes widened, never expecting that Lionel would actually choose to do such a thing. Even the elders were at a loss to deal with what was happening right now. But they were also well aware that this had been tacitly allowed. The moment Dune didn't receive a reprimand for forcefully throwing 2 white belts onto the stage, was the exact moment everyone realized that this so-called selection was nothing but a free-for-all. The so-called rules were nothing more than a thin veneer, enveloping what was nothing more than chaos. The members of Bear Rose weren't left with any choice. They all shot forward, feeling the pressure Lionel placed on their shoulders. It felt as though a beast had been unleashed from its chains. The instant Lionel's feet landed on the ground, he found himself pressed by 4 attacks. But his spear pierced forward just as many times, a flow of golden light enveloping his body. His spear technique seemed slow, leaving afterimages in its wake. For a moment, it looked like Lionel had split into 4 people, each wielding the very same spear and sending out the very same attack. The air exploded, rings of fire raining downward and space warping. Lionel reflected their weapons with a speed and deftness that numbed the mind. Even pressed by so many high-level opponents, he seemed intent on pressing forward, rage lighting his eyes. If he could just crush them all, if there were just no obstacles left before him, no enemies to fight, no looming danger to worry about, would he still have to feel this way? Would she still have to feel this way? Lionel's spear spun in his hands, a wheel and vicious wall of fire manifesting. The participants scattered, fear evident in their eyes. The destruction Lionel was levying against Bear Rose was the likes of which they had never seen from a white belt. It was the kind of anger and pure rage that seethed from the soul. Lionel roared, bronze runes flickering to life as his irises turned a violet red. The earth beneath his feet crumbled, sinking down into a crater under the pressure of just a single step. The Bear Rose members felt as though a boulder had just smashed down on their heads from above. Was this a gravity field? How could it be so powerful? These sort of area of effectabilities shouldn't be so strong in the hands of a third-dimension existence standing on a fifth-dimensional world. Unfortunately, Lionel's speed only seemed to get faster. Illusory wings spread from his back, radiating out white and deep golds that was almost blinding to look at. With a flicker, Lionel's spear shot through a chest. Before the Bear Rose member could even react to the bloody hole that had opened up within him, Lionel had already appeared before another. Lionel's hand ripped through the air like a claw, grabbing onto the shoulder of a female Bear Rose member and pulling downward. A shocking cry left her lips as her left shoulder was shattered into meat paste. Unfortunately, whatever was left of her cry was cut short when Lionel's foot collapsed her midsection, sending whatever air she had left in her lungs jetting out like a stream. At that moment, the wheels of fire Lionel had already sent out collided with as much as 5 Bear Rose members. Their shrieks and cries sounded, their armor practically melting onto their bodies with each passing second. It was exactly then that the wheels imploded, raining down embers from above. The region was completely decimated. Lionel stood with his gaze still lit with fury. Every time he looked at the half-dead bodies of the Bear Rose members, he only got angrier. It didn't need to be this way, it didn't have to be this way. Everything about this, from start to finish, was simply infuriating. Within the stands, Magneral sat at a loss. She simply couldn't wrap her mind around what was going on. How could he have such strength? His movements almost made it seem like everyone was happily walking into his spear. Lionel looked up into the skies, his rage palpable. In one motion he threw his spear. With a bang it landed dead center on his platform. Since you all want death, I'll give you death. The next person to dare challenge me, I'll send to the underworld. Chapter 736. Bang. Aina felt a small gasp of air jet out from her body as her back smashed against the wall of Lionel's room. The impact was so fierce that the wall cracked, leaving a small crater that just barely fit her petite body. However, before she could catch her breath, she felt herself being enveloped, Lionel's lips suffocating her. Aina felt her clothes being ripped away, her body swaying like a boat in a storm under the whims of Lionel. A heat seared her chest, her heart boiling. Someone else might have felt uncomfortable beneath Lionel's smoldering heat. But to her, it felt as though she was drifting on cloud 9. Her body took in the assault with open arms. Everything from Lionel's roughness, to the strength of his hands, to the coldness in his eyes made her shiver. She felt an excitement the likes of which she never had before, an excitement that even somewhat faintly surpassed all the orgasms Lionel had helped her experience until now. When Lionel dragged her away from the selection, fury still lighting his eyes, she hadn't known exactly what to expect. But when Lionel actually threw her against a wall, the small gasp that came from her mouth registered like a struggle for air in her mind, but the reality was that it came out almost like an excited squeal. It was the kind of sound that captured the hearts of men, latched on, and refused to let go, squeezing until they lost all rationality while hovering between a line of life and death. Such a small impact hardly even jarred Aina's inner organs, let alone caused her any harm. The training she put herself through made these walls they were cratering, the furniture they were smashing and the floors they were collapsing seem like nothing more than child's play. As though a pair of wild beasts, the couple seemed to unleash their frustration onto one another. Aina's nails clawed into Lionel's back, leaving bloody streaks even his metal body couldn't defend against. She sheared through his Tier 4 defenses as though a hot knife through butter. Lionel's blood seeped into her nails, subconsciously being drawn into her body. But the result was far beyond Aina's expectations. The instant Lionel's blood clashed with her own, a deep moan left her lips, her pelvis grinding against the bulge in Lionel's boxers. Lionel's blood was like a drug pumping through her veins. It carried a scorching heat and a soothing mellow. It was a dichotomy of feelings that almost perfectly meshed with the feeling of Lionel's tongue in her mouth. In that instant, as though being burned by hot coals, Aina's curse screeched. Pain Aina had experienced for a lifetime suddenly retreated into the depths of her body, fleeing from Lionel's blood. However, Aina hardly seemed to notice. She continued to greedily absorb Lionel's blood, feeling as though the two of them were finally fusing into one. At that moment, Aina realized that she loved Lionel, loved Lionel so much that it left a throbbing pain in her chest. Her body began to enter its real form. Her slender legs, wrapped around Lionel's waist, became longer. Her breasts, pushing against the fabric of her chest band, threatened to rip out a path for themselves even without Lionel's input. Her scars already retreated, leaving a visage so perfect behind that the energies of the world seemed to sing. Her hips became fuller, her bottom rounder, her hair longer. Lionel's mind was too calculative to not notice these changes, and he also immediately understood what was happening. His heart thrummed out of his chest, rebounding against his rib cage and sending vibrations to Aina's own. The heat in Lionel's lower belly continued to rise. His rushing blood made his cock so hard that it sprung out from the elastic bands of his boxers. Aina felt the scalding heat touch her inner thighs, her body trembling with excitement. Her amber eyes brightened into a luscious gold, an overwhelming mental dominance being exuded from her body. She pushed forward, her slender legs touching the ground as she pushed Lionel into the opposing wall. Her strength was so great that it completely collapsed. However, she didn't seem to notice as her cherry lips enveloped Lionel's, her graceful legs stepping out from her pants with an elegance that was impossible to match. The skin-tight, black panties beneath completely outlined her silhouette. But Lionel only got to see the enticing sight for only a split moment before he felt that soft, small pink tongue slide into his mouth. From being just 57, Aina had grown to over 60 tall, leaving her just 3 or 4 inches shorter than Lionel. Rising just a bit on her tippy toes, she was able to taste those lips she couldn't get enough of. However, her dominance didn't last for long before she found herself being hoisted into the air again. A sturdy hand ripped her chest band away. The healthy bounce of 2 fleshly mounds was cut short as they pressed flush against Lionel's chest. The couple left devastation in their wake, a trail of destruction following after them as they somehow traveled from room to room of the segmented cube. I can't take it anymore. Lionel's hoarse growl made Aina shiver. At the moment, she was perpetually releasing a sort of mental coercion that even Lionel wasn't immune to. The instant Aina's curse was suppressed, it felt as though her soul force had become no weaker than even Lionel's own. But rather than being tailored for computation, Aina's soul force seemed to be able to cast the mind into a state of absolute obedience, as though the whole world should call her queen. Aina's hips shifted, one hand wrapped around Lionel's neck. She used the other to slide her skin-tight panties off. With the soft sound of skin slapping against skin, Lionel felt his cock gently split the delicate folds of skin so soft his mind went blank. Aina blushed profusely. "Do you have a condom?" Lionel choked on air. "It's live, people, this is not a drill." Official Vampire Empress Aina art available on my Instagram right now, smiley face @ospec_. Can't believe I'm sharing these goodies with you all. Should have kept her to myself. Chapter 737. Even after so many years of advancement, Earth only had 2 methods for male birth control, the condom and the vasectomy. Luckily, the latter had become quite an easy procedure and had a near 100% guarantee of reattachment later down the line, while the former had become so advanced it felt as though it wasn't there to begin with. But, unluckily, Lionel had neither of these things on him. At this point he felt like shedding real tears. These matters weren't even close to being at the forefront of Lionel's mind. He was a lifelong virgin despite his standing in high school. And even if he hadn't been, something like a condom was nothing more than a press of a button away. Now though, the watch on his wrist that he had practically completely forgotten about was nothing more than scrap metal, especially after entering a 5th-dimensional world. Beyond that, there wasn't even a guarantee that a condom from a 3rd-dimensional world would even work on the current him. For all he knew, he shot out real bullets at this point. They say that a normal 3rd-dimensional male could already dwarf 40 kilometers an hour. Lionel didn't know if his training would affect this, but if it did, he had to assume it would be far beyond just that. As though thinking of all this wasn't depressing enough, even if Lionel wanted to choose the option of a reversible vasectomy, could he even find a skilled enough and strong enough doctor to cut into his body? As complicated as all of this was, Aina probably had even less options. All female birth control options relied on a keen understanding of their biology. Who knew how much different Aina's biology was not from when she had been in the 3rd dimension? Fuck. Lionel stood there, his forehead leaning against Aina's own. Somehow they had managed to crash their way all the way to kitchen. In fact, at this moment, Aina sat on the large stainless steel table at its very center, still subtly grinding against Lionel. It was very clear that the both of them wanted to go a step further, but Aina's question had doused them both with a bucket of cold water. At this point, they couldn't help but think of the situation that got them here in the first place. Even they had to admit that it wasn't exactly the healthiest of things. If it wasn't for Aina knowing that she most definitely couldn't risk having children right now, they likely would have both lost themselves to the heat of the moment. Even now, Lionel could feel Aina's fragrant juices moistening the tip of his cock. It was almost maddening. Just a single thrust and he would probably experience the greatest feeling this world had to offer. However, as his mind cooled down, he realized that this matter was deeper than just not having birth control. There was a deeper issue that neither of them seemed to want to deal with. Lionel felt Aina cup his cheek. His head was pulled up to match her gaze, his breathing hitching as he laid eyes on her flawless countenance. Lionel had never cared what Aina looked like. But to have the emotions he had for her reaffirmed by the existence of this goddess before him was almost too much to handle. It was already difficult enough for him to control himself around Aina normally, but at that moment, it felt as though all his inhibitions were being knocked down one after another. Lionel barely stopped his hips from thrusting forward, his thighs trembling as he grit his teeth. Aina's breathing became somewhat haggard. Though Lionel hadn't completely pierced through her final lines of defense, she could still feel herself opening up. It was at most half a centimeter or two, yet the feeling was already so intoxicating. Aina knew how dangerous this position was. The very entrance was among the most sensitive regions for a woman. Let alone Lionel, even she was playing with fire right now. That didn't even consider the danger of the leaking of Lionel's own fluids. Taking a deep breath and gathering up willpower he didn't know he had, Lionel pulled away. He felt as though he was about to burst, but he also knew that this was the best decision. If it was up to him, he would put a child in Aina right this very moment. It would probably be selfish of him to do so, but the same way Aina wanted to keep him safe, so did he too want to keep her safe. As powerless as he was, making her belly round and her feet swollen seemed to be the only method he could think of. Lionel was so absent-minded that he didn't notice when Aina had pushed herself off the steel table and begun to pull at his hand. He followed behind her, barely keeping track of the swaying pendulum of her waist. He almost felt that it was unfortunate her long hair obstructed so much of the view. For the first time, Lionel had a negative emotion toward the long hair he loved so much. Before Lionel could react, he found himself in Aina's room, seemingly the only one their rampage had missed. Truthfully, the two usually slept together nowadays, so this room remained relatively unused and had been that way for months already. However, at this point it was a saving grace. Aina sat Lionel down on the edge of the bed, her next action making his eyes widen and his heart skip a beat. Aina sat on her knees between his legs, looking up at him with a somewhat nervous and bashful expression. At that moment, Lionel's cock throbbed. He hadn't thought it was possible to feel more turned on at this point, but the image of a beauty with the face of a goddess kneeling before him like this made his blood seethe. Aina's slender fingers grabbed forward, her two hands wrapping around his member with a gentleness that only made it pulse more. Then, with slow movements, Lionel caught every frame of her slightly parted cherry lips kissed the very tip. Lionel felt the greatest humiliation he had in his life right at that very moment. He didn't survive to even experience the softness of her small pink tongue. Shit. Aina was confused by the word until she suddenly wasn't. With reflexes that surpassed human understanding, she dodged out of the way. Unfortunately, the ceiling could not. Chapter 738. Lionel took long, deep breaths. Somehow, that one shot seemed to have drained him completely. Looking up at the ceiling, he smiled bitterly. He had been partially joking when he spoke of the 40 kilometers an hour matter. But why did it look like someone had been throwing darts at the ceiling? Replaying it in his mind, Lionel realized that he had been right. It was at least a several 100-kilometer difference. And the volume was much greater, giving it more impact. Aina, who still kneeled before Lionel, her head having dodged out of the way, suddenly giggled. Lionel choked. What you laughing about? It's not my fault you suddenly turned into a succubus. Aina, though, only continued to giggle. She wasn't laughing at Lionel. Rather, she was laughing in happiness. For some reason, these series of events made her very happy. For just a moment, she seemed to forget all of her worries. With the actions of a caring wife, Aina found a moist towel in her room and began to clean Lionel's cock with gentle strokes. This action left her at peace and also resurfaced some of her memories that made her smile deepen. The truth was that Lionel stunk slightly of sweat right now. It wasn't anything too potent, but it was the truth nonetheless. After all, the two had just been at the selection not much more than 20 or so minutes ago. Then they probably used even more energy during their battle just now. After Lionel made his declaration, not a single other person dared to challenge him. What a joke, he had just single-handedly wiped out the more elite members of Bear Rose. Was there even a point to continuing the selection? Still, Aina didn't care very much about Lionel's slight stink, even to the point of not minding to touch her lips to it. That said, just because she didn't care didn't mean Lionel didn't. It was part of that anxiety and realizing he was too late to stop Aina's actions that made him fail to control himself. In the end, he could hardly savor the feeling before he blasted off. Lionel watched Aina work with a smile on her face, an indescribable feeling of warmth spreading through his chest. At that moment he too realized that he loved her so much that his heart hurt. Yet for some reason, much like Aina, he didn't say those words aloud either. Lionel pushed Aina's hand aside and scooped her up, catching her somewhat off guard. "Oof, you've gotten heavier." Aina's brow shot up. "What did you say?" Nothing. Lionel laughed. Lionel smiled. He found that Aina's every emotion seemed to have an area of effect to it. It was quite interesting, almost like she was imposing her will onto the world subconsciously. The couple entered the bathhouse and began to clean themselves off. An air of comfortable silence hung between them as they helped each other. It was as though they had already been doing this for years. "I didn't know my blood would be of such help to you," Lionel said after a while, helping Aina to shampoo her hair with his favorite apple scent. "If I had known, we could have done this long ago. How do you feel?" Aina smiled. "I feel better than I have in a long time. The curse isn't gone, but it seems too afraid to surface." Lionel nodded. "I think it might be because of my Snowy Star Owl lineage factor and my Scarlet Star Force. I already awakened my healing branch, and after my innate node recovered to its mature form, it subtly changed the characteristics of my star, light and fire elements." Aina's brows arched in understanding. If Lionel's healing factor was combined with the destructive capability of his Scarlet Star Force, and especially the purifying characteristic of the Star Force aspects, then his blood would indeed be the bane of all poisons and curses. This was only made better by Lionel's mage core. After synergizing with his body, Lionel's passing healing factor was more than tenfold stronger than it had been in the past. "What do you think, can my blood heal you?" Lionel asked. There was no better person to ask this question than Aina. Who better than her, with her ability to perfectly understand her body, to have the right answer? Lionel was quite prepared to be disappointed by the answer, but he was shocked by the reality. "I think so, yes. The curse has already been burned away by more than a percentage point. Even though it's hiding, it's my body, I can easily find it. If my mind is clearer next time, shaving it down by even 5 or 10 percentage points with the same amount of blood wouldn't be an issue." Lionel grinned. This was a pleasant surprise indeed. He had thought that he would need to do far more to find a cure for Aina, when the reality was that he was the cure. "You know," Lionel blinked. Aina turned back to meet his gaze, her supple breasts in full view. They looked like perfect droplets of ambrosia, shaped by the hands of a master sculptor. Their small, pink protrusions especially still made Lionel gasp for air even now. It was a lethal combination that ruined what was an otherwise wholesome moment. Aina smiled but didn't seem to mind Lionel's gaze. She had gotten used to it. "Your blood is very valuable," Aina continued. "I only had a small bit of it, but I felt my strength take a large leap forward. Are you sure you want to give me so much of it?" Lionel raised his brows. "What nonsense are you saying right now? Why would I care about any of that?" Lionel shook his head, reaching a hand forward to caress Aina's cheek. Her skin had always been this soft, but without the trenches of her scars, it felt endlessly supple. Aina pushed herself up to the tips of her toes, planting a gentle kiss on Lionel's lips. Chapter 739. Lionel's hands outlined Aina's silhouette. Her figure was so much fuller that he felt as though he could lose his fingers in the softness of her flesh. By the time he grabbed handfuls of her ass, he felt his breathing had already grown heavy. Even experiencing her touch now, he had a hard time fathoming how something could feel so good. So springy, so elastic. It had just a touch of firm muscle, only to be surrounded by a supple flesh that was beyond words. "Ow." Aina pulled back, biting Lionel's lip in acute retaliation. "If you pull any harder, you'll rip them off." Lionel laughed when he heard these words. Aina's voice had a subtle change to it after her transformation. The best way Lionel could describe it was like two silk sheets gliding against each other. Her cadence seemed to tickle at his ears, enticing him with every step. He really could barely hold back. But this time he managed to control himself. One day when the time was right, he would taste her ripeness. And hopefully by then the issues the two of them had yet to address would also be concluded. Neither of them seemed eager to speak on these things, but for the first time, Lionel didn't feel like he was running from it. Rather, he simply didn't know how to put what he was feeling into words, and Aina seemed to be the same way. But Lionel wasn't worried. Were all relationships nothing but smooth sailing? Even with his limited experience, Lionel didn't believe so. There would always be a push and pull, an effort both parties had to put in. Given enough time, Lionel was confident that they'd be able to take that step together. And when that day came, he would definitely put a baby in this goddess. After all, he had to make sure everyone knew that she was his. Lionel suddenly felt a pinch at his waist. What nasty thoughts are you thinking about? Lionel was stunned before he burst into a fit of laughter. It seemed that Aina's senses had become almost too good after her curse retreated. It was like she could practically read his mind now. Nothing much, just thinking of marking some territory, Lionel said with a devious smile. Territory? In territory now? Aina blinked quite adorably, however her gaze seemed to hide a dangerous light. Of course I have to mark you off properly. We wouldn't want someone else trying to claim you, right? How embarrassing would that be? I see. I think it's better if we mark you off first. Not as territory though. I think you'd be a good little puppy, it'll get you a nice leash. Wouldn't want you going around to mark other territories that weren't yours, right? How embarrassing would that be? Aina's eyes blinked with a beautiful twinkling light. Her smile was gorgeous to an extreme. The mental pressure of her gaze was so strong that Lionel almost asked her where the leash was so he could go and get it. The time for the opening of the Valiant Heart Zone came quickly. Usually, there would be a few weeks to even month buffer period to allow those who would enter time to prep and prime themselves. But this time, it felt as though everything was being sped along at an accelerated pace. The chosen time for the zone's opening was the day following the selection. Since of the participants that were chosen, only a single one of them suffered injuries, it was decided that time for rest wasn't needed. What was surprising though, was this singular injured student was none other than Radley's, who had managed to claim the fourth and final spot for himself. After Lionel had taken out the Bear Rose members, the landscape had shifted. However, it definitely shouldn't have shifted enough for Radley's to claim a spot. After all, there were still the remaining King of Or's members, there were the Severed Heart faction members that hadn't made a move, and on top of that, there were still the other members of the Hero faction. It could be said, then, that though Lionel's action had undoubtedly helped Radley's, if he hadn't had such strength of his own, he would have never come so far. Such a thing would have left Lionel feeling intrigued. If he had known about it, that is. Neither Lionel nor Aina had taken a step into the outside world for about a day now and were simply enjoying each other's company. The matters of what was happening here wouldn't be known to them until they actually appeared. At this moment though, many were already gathering around the Valiant Pillars. The ceremony for entry into the Valiant Heart Zone wasn't one they got to see often, so many didn't want to miss it. Beyond this though, there were some small benefits to be gained by being near the entrance. It was said that those nearby could be blessed by the aura of the Valiant Pillars, allowing them some minor breakthroughs. Though their gains wouldn't be anywhere near as good as the youths who entered, it was at least something, right? Still, rather than being filled with an excited air, the atmosphere was quite solemn. At the center of the pillars stood a group of elders, but one singular man stood out amidst them all. This man was none other than the current head of the organization, Hutchin. Even given his age, his body rippled with vitality, his bronzed muscles shimmering beneath the rising sun. Since this man was still silent, no one dared to breathe a word. Can't you at least let me be a lion or tiger pet or something? Why a puppy of all things? This is spousal abuse. Who's your wife? The two voices weren't very loud, but the second one especially seemed to grip at all their hearts. Never had they heard a voice so soothing and enticing. Rather than reprimanding, many couldn't help but crane their necks to see where it had come from. But what they saw left them all at a loss. In that moment, Lionel might as well have been invisible despite the fact he held her hand. The two descended down the mountain pass, but the world seemed to revolve around just one of them despite the fact she wore a mask and her figure was hidden behind a black military uniform. Chapter 740? Lionel was speechless. How Aina was still drawing so much attention even while wearing her mask was beyond him. To Lionel, he didn't particularly care how the world saw Aina. When she chose to wear her mask out today, he hadn't said a word. After all, to the current Aina, the mask was about more than just hiding her face. She treated it like a present to be treasured, much like the necklace he had given her for her birthday. Plus, she wasn't quite used to her new face yet. Rather than having to waste her time talking and explaining things to people she didn't care about, she would rather just hide herself completely and leave her looks for the only one who mattered. To make things worse, Aina had even covered up most of her body wearing her black military uniform once again. Of course, this was because Lionel had tactlessly ripped away her Valiant Heart outfit during their battle. But one would have thought that this would make her even less conspicuous. Yet all it took was just a single word from her in range of the crowd's hearing for hundreds of pairs of eyes to land on her as though a pack of lustful wolves. It truly wasn't their fault though. Aina's mental coercion was on a level these students and even the elders had never experienced before. Her every action seemed to put them into a trance. She wasn't even swaying her hips as she moved, yet her gait mesmerized them all nonetheless. Lionel's lip twitched, his eyes narrowing into a glare. It was only after his own presence solidified that many were snapped out of their daze, looking toward him with a hint of apprehension. Even at that point, though, it was hard not to wonder where this woman had come from. It was only those who recognized the blue-veined mask Aina wore that seemed to make the connection. But even then they were greatly confused. Could a person undergo so many changes in just one night? Lionel and Aina made it to their designated location within the mountain pass. Technically they weren't late, but it seemed that everyone was so eager to get this done that they had all come early. This even included the likes of Raylion and Hephaestus, who one would have assumed would come last. This only meant, then, that regardless of what Lionel wanted, the path of him and Aina was followed even down to the final moment. Eventually, 12 youths stood before the elders of Valiant Heart. Elder Magneral stepped forward. Clearly, it was still her duty to complete the last rites for this event. However, at this moment she was greatly confused. Who are you? Magneral was trying her best to keep her calm, honestly. Given the current situation, she couldn't snap and rant like she wanted to. After all, they were in the presence of the head. And although Raylion had been causing quite some stirs in recent months, there was no one who could shake his position. Even Raylion was very far from doing so. However, even if she couldn't do as she pleased, that didn't mean she wasn't inwardly seething. Of course, she recognized Aina's mask. But, was she also supposed to just believe that this person was Aina just because of this? For all she knew, Lionel had had this harlot wear this mask so that he could try to sneak her in. But not only was this woman not wearing the official garb of their organization, but she was clearly not Aina. She was much taller, her demeanor seemed different, her ability felt different, and even her voice had undergone a subtle change. To Magneral, Aina's current voice sounded like someone who was trying their best to sound like her, and was just missing the mark by a small tidbit. That small tidbit of difference was the reason why all these men and even the women couldn't take their eyes off of her. The elders looked at this situation with a frown. The selection had happened for a reason. They couldn't just allow anyone into their most valuable treasure. Of course, at this moment things were a bit different. Whereas usually the topmost echelon of elders would be missing, they were here now. As such, those that knew of Lionel's true identity were likewise here. Looking toward one another, they saw a tinge of helplessness in their eyes. If Lionel wanted to bypass their rules and bring just a single person in, they should just allow it, right? Head Hutchin turned his gaze toward Lionel. For the current youth before him, this gaze was still heavy. In fact, Lionel seemed to notice it immediately and looked up. For the first time, Lionel and this mysterious head of Valiant Heart met face to face. But Lionel felt that this man was difficult to read. "I am Aina Brazinger," Aina replied softly. Toward this response, Magneral's brow only furrowed deeper. Was this harlot really still trying to fool her? Magneral looked toward Lionel, a fury hardly hidden in the depths of her eyes. Her precious disciple had fallen for this bastard and he had actually betrayed her like this. How could she not be furious? If it was up to her, she would cut Lionel down where he stood. Lionel felt this murderous gaze too. But toward this he could only bitterly smile. This really was Aina. How else was he supposed to prove this? It was at that moment that Aina pulled her mask off. For an instant, the air seemed to come to a grinding halt. "Ah, damn it." Lionel clicked his tongue. Aina rolled her eyes and ignored him as her body began to change. A looming curse energy formed into a fog around her face, obscuring the enchanting view. Her body shrunk, her military uniform downsizing along with it. Do you recognize me now, teacher? Aina spoke in her former voice. At that point, Magneral was stunned into silence. Chapter 741. It's live, people, this is not a drill. Official Vampire Empress Aina art available on my Instagram right now, smiley face at @ospec_. Can't believe I'm sharing these goodies with you all. Should have kept her to myself. After finding a path to cure her curse, Aina chose not to get rid of it completely. She had complete dominance over it with her ability and could continue to use it as she had in the past to help with her training. Doing something like exploiting its effects for a moment to prove her identity was as easy as breathing, even though it put her in an uncomfortable position for a few moments. Not long later, though, she returned to her true form, the form that left her feeling the most comfortable. Like this, she felt as though she could destroy a mountain range with a step and hold the world in the palm of her hands. For a moment, that flawless countenance appeared again. Her shapely nose, the gentle slope of her jaw, her willowy brows and slender neck. It was all perfect to an extreme. But it only appeared for just a moment before she blocked it all with her mask. Maybe some of the most stunned people by this change other than Magneral were the likes of Balthorn, Radlease and the other freshmen. Radlease still remembered making fun of Lionel for his poor choice in women, while Balthorn very clearly remembered why it was that Lionel didn't like her very much in the first place. But now, it felt like this woman they had once poked fun of had become an untouchable goddess. Hephaestus, who stood in the line of 12 youths, raised an eyebrow. He had never thought that the girl he had picked up actually had a true appearance like this. If it hadn't been for Aina's less than optimal looks, the method they used to try to put Lionel in his place would have been very different. At this point, let alone Hephaestus, even Raylion's heart, which was usually as calm as the unmoving surface of a lake, woke up for just a moment. Hephaestus grinned a toothy grin. If they thought that it was all sunshine and roses after entering the zone, they would be sorely mistaken. Lionel, sensing Hephaestus' gaze, looked over. Lionel's eyes were placid, his demeanor completely unmoved by the toothy grin he saw. Instead, his gaze shifted down to the twin daggers by Hephaestus' waist, his lip curling with disdain. Hephaestus froze. The words Lionel spoke all those months ago about how pathetic his weapons were suddenly rang in his ears like a furiously ringing bell. Outside of his control, his face suddenly burned hot as though Lionel's gaze alone carried a fiery heat. Hephaestus remembered exactly the kind of contempt he had treated Lionel's statement with back then, only to find out that Lionel had meant every word of it. Lionel shook his head, a look of pity lighting his eyes as he looked away. But this only infuriated Hephaestus even more. "Boy, I'll make sure you pay." Lionel ignored Hephaestus' heated gaze. As far as he was concerned, let alone dealing with him, his lovely girlfriend probably didn't need any help at all to all but solo them. Lionel didn't know where Aina's limit lied at this moment, but he knew that it was most definitely not shallow. At that moment, Magneral and the other elders finally recovered. "Little Aina. Your curse, it's lifted?" Aina nodded. "My boyfriend helped me find a way." Magneral opened her mouth to respond, but the sound of Aina's enchanting voice saying the word boyfriend seemed to shatter the budding fantasies of countless youths. That's good." Magneral squeezed out a smile. Though it seemed forced due to her irrational hatred of Lionel, there was still a wave of genuineness found within her eyes. Clearly she was very happy for Aina. "I guess this old bat isn't so bad after all," Lionel thought with a smile. Still, Magneral was confused. The person that should be happiest about this lifted curse should be Aina. But why did she sound like she was speaking of just another matter? It seems that there is indeed something weighing heavily on this young girl. Magneral sighed. She had known that Aina was carrying a heavy weight long ago. She could only hope that Lionel could help her bear some of the burden. Magneral nodded. "Since these matters have been settled, we can move on to important matters." Magneral stood straight, regaining her dignified air. "These matters have been a barely hidden secret for a long while, but the elders have decided to speak of them in blunt terms. Our valiant heart is at a crossroads. We face internal enemies in the Oryx and external enemies in the Milky Way. We have sat at the top for a long while and the beasts chewing at our scraps have become restless, wanting a larger piece of the pie." Magneral's words were simple, but they seemed to make the blood of the crowd boil. Who would ever want things that were rightfully theirs snatched away by another? This valiant heart zone to my back represents the pride of my valiant heart mountain. It is our most treasured possession and the light we use to guide the leaders of the next generation. When you enter, I hope you understand the important role you play, and I hope that you grasp every opportunity presented to you. I will not lie. The Valiant Heart Zone is not without danger. The longer a zone is forcefully held open like this as opposed to clearing it, the more variables can appear. Our Valiant Heart Zone is especially susceptible to this because it is a variant zone that reflects the future. Variant zones are meant to be the easiest and safest zones to enter, however, our Valiant Heart Zone has long since stopped being such a thing. In my heart, I wish for you all to enter as children and exit as men and women, to enter as foot soldiers and exit as generals. You are the pride of our valiant heart, our future. Magnaral's voice resonated through the quiet mountain pass, a heavy atmosphere only growing heavier at that moment. Go forward and claim what is yours. The valiant pillars began to quake, an overwhelming surge of energy descending from above and crashing down toward the 12 youths. This force had every intention of forcing them to their knees. Chapter 742. In the face of such overwhelming pressure, Lionel and Aina were unmoved. If before it had been difficult for Aina to climb this mountain pass, at this current instant, she felt like she was walking through a field of fragrant breeze. Hand in hand, the couple glided forward, a number of the other 12 following along with them. Counting the number of individuals who took this pressure in stride, there was Hephaestus, Raylion, Sail, and 2 others that Lionel did not recognize. But, from what it seemed like, one of them was from Bear Rose and the other was from Severed Heart. Among those struggling, there was the remaining member of the former Valiant Hall, a member of Bear Rose and Severed Heart, along with Radley's. Of all these, there was just one person Lionel didn't account for, and he was the 4th individual to gain a spot of entry alongside Lionel, Aina and Radley's. And that person was King of Ors, Sarioth. Sarioth seemed to be at the very center of the pack. He didn't seem to be mightily struggling, but he also didn't seem to be having an easy time either. Even to Lionel, this in-between state seemed genuine. If Sarioth was faking it, he'd have to be on a completely different level entirely. Chapter 743. T feel bad saying even have a real upload schedule and quota now. Sorry guys, sad face. Thanks for sticking with me, love. Lionel's eyes narrowed, but he didn't even have the time to process what was really going on before a certain agile shadow flickered toward his back. Since Lionel and Aina had entered first, despite the sheer size of the hall, the remaining 10 members were all following to their backs. So, it wasn't surprising that they tried to take such a chance. Lionel's eyes sharpened, his palm flipping over to reveal a silver arrow as he quickly whipped backward. Sparks flew as metal clanged. Hephaestus bore down on Lionel with a toothy grin, his twin daggers having pierced toward the latter's heart. Yet, Lionel was clashing with one with his reinforced arrow and had caught Hephaestus' wrist with his other hand. Feeling Hephaestus' strength personally for the first time, Lionel's gaze couldn't help but narrow. Even with his tear metal body, he would have been blown away had he not immediately reinforced himself with 4 Seasons Realm Universal Force. Though this long-armed, hypermuscular man was an annoyance, there was no doubt that he had real strength. Chapter 744. Chapter 744 targets Lionel's mind calculated many things in a split instant. To be able to create a hold in this sort of marble was a feat in and of itself. It took strength beyond Tier 8 alone. However, this was just the beginning. Creating a hole was one thing, but doing it so perfectly that no cracks were formed in its creation was a completely different matter. It showed a level of ease that made one's spine tingle. There were 2 last factors that would truly make one shocked. The first was the speed. Between Lionel sensing Raylion's intention and the actual execution, there was no more than a split moment. The second was the distance. Raylion had been able to complete that near-instantaneous attack from over 10 meters away and seemingly without a hint of fatigue. Everything about his actions was nonchalant and casual. Lionel took a deep breath, using the momentum of his explosive step backward to glide along the marble back to Aina's side. It was only then that he looked up and gazed toward Raylion. Without a word, he flipped his palm over. Many eyes narrowed when they saw the appearance of the small disc, thinking that Lionel was going to do something with it. After all, which of them here dared to underestimate such a high-level force crafter? Who knew what sort of gadgets he had? However, they only got more nervous when they saw Lionel's lips move but no sound travel to them. What's his ability? Ping. Subject, Raylion. Telekinesis. Evolution stage, Tier 7 bronze. When Lionel heard this, his brows furrowed. What is his ability index? Ping. Replying to Seed 2-star amplification stage, Lionel took in a breath. Now he understood. He had already gone through the ability index once and memorized it all. The telekinesis ability index was separated from lowest to highest: control, strength, amplification, and finally, sublimation. For Raylion to be at the 2-star amplification stage, it meant that he was one sub-level away from the very peak of the amplification stage. It could be said that in terms of progression in his ability, he wasn't too far away from Lionel. And the fact he reached this level while still in the bronze grade spoke to the potential for growth he still had. This was extraordinarily rare, exceedingly so for a person born within a fifth-dimensional world. From what Lionel understood, control was the weakest. This was the level Aina's good friend Yuri was at with her ability, at least when it was initially awakened. This level allowed one to enforce control over things outside of one's body. The next step, strength, took this a level beyond. Strength represented the ability to enforce more power with your telekinesis than your body could alone. As one might expect, the power of this level varied greatly from person to person. But usually, this strength was not small. Even a petite young girl who could hardly move a 20-kilogram weight on her own might be able to shatter boulders 10 times her size after reaching this level. Then there was the third level. This was Raylion's level. At this stage, the amplification stage, one would gain a subtle and fine control over their telekinesis that allowed them to apply it directly to their body without risking harm. It was this subtle and precise control that allowed Raylion to imprint such a hole into the ground without causing even a crack to spread. It was also this control that allowed him to give form to his mental strength, making Lionel feel as though a steel pillar was falling upon him from above. Lionel's lips curled into a smile. This ability was indeed worth all the hopes the elders had pinned onto him. Lionel was even a bit jealous. It was just a shame that this Raylion had chosen to be his enemy for reasons that still made little sense to Lionel himself. This Raylion seemed to think that Lionel cared about what little authority controlling this organization would give him, when the reality was, Lionel didn't care about Valiant Heart at all. At that moment, Hephaestus slowly pulled himself up from the ground, his pupils having mutated into slits. It was clear that now he was truly serious, his gaze practically boring holes into Lionel. However, Lionel wasn't looking at him at all. Rather, from start to finish, Lionel's eyes were trained onto Raylion, who also had his eyes locked onto him. Putting his dictionary away, Lionel looked away from Raylion and back toward the bronze soldiers that were blocking their path forward. Then he looked toward the group of 10 before him and Aina again. Did they really have to kill 2? But what if in the end there was only him and Aina left? Would this damnable place ask him to kill her? How far did it want to go exactly? The best decision for Lionel would be to kill these opponents and place them within his snow globe. If he was lucky, then the zone wouldn't register them being alive and allow them to pass. However, how would he convince these people to do such a thing? The simple answer was that he couldn't. One way or another, he'd have to defeat them first. Dealing with Raylion with how flexible his ability was right now was impossible in such a chaotic battle. That likewise meant that Hephaestus was also off the board. This meant that there were 8 people he could possibly eliminate right now. The atmosphere grew heavier and heavier. The weakest among them felt cold sweat trickling down their brows, their fingers twitching. Many of them seemed to be about to make the first move out of sheer nervousness, unable to take the mental pressure that was bearing down on them. It was in that exact instant that Raylion and Lionel suddenly moved in unison. However, their targets were far outside of everyone's expectations. Bang! Bang! Lionel's eyes narrowed, slowly lowering a bow that had appeared so quickly people hardly registered that it had been there. With a crash, the 2 bronze projections shattered into motes of light that surged toward the 2. Lionel and Raylion both reached out a hand, snatching their rewards out of the air. Chapter 745. Chapter 745, Resemblance? It's live, people, this is not a drill. Official Vampire Empress Aina art available on my Instagram right now, smiley face at @ospec_. Can't believe I'm sharing these goodies with you all. Should have kept her to myself. The bronze light slowly coalesced, forming in a transparent orb. It looked no different from a polished crystal ball except for the faint light it gave off. Lionel rolled the ball between his fingers, a curious light in his eyes. As though sensing something, his hand suddenly squeezed into a fist, shattering the orbs of light and causing a mysterious energy to surge into his body. The moment Lionel felt this energy, his eyes narrowed. Now that Lionel had learned his lesson, he no longer used soul force, at least in its normal form. Whenever he deployed his internal sight or used his magic, it was now all controlled by his dream force. Over time he came to realize that this did more than just give him a basal boost to his abilities, there were some more interesting and insightful tidbits as well. For example, when Lionel used his internal sight now, he felt that he was more sensitive. It wasn't just that his range had grown explosively, but he felt like his attention to detail was far greater. If he used his internal sight to smell, Lionel felt that he was even better than most beasts at this point, and that was just one instance. So, when Lionel observed the changes to his body now, his attention to detail was far greater. He could see his blood moving through his veins and arteries, he could see nerve signals firing within his nervous system. He could even see the perforations in his bone leading to his marrow. As a result, the moment the energy entered his body, Lionel almost instantly understood what it did. It was identical to the energy he received from the puppet master. Though in far lesser quantity and quality, this energy was able to open up the path of bottlenecks that lay before him. Albeit to a very small extent, he felt the bottleneck to his Tier 5 metal body loosen just a small nudge, a nudge he might not have even noticed before. Lionel nodded to himself. So it's like this? There were many eyes trained onto Lionel. But this made sense. If they had to choose a person to display any sort of greed over, it would definitely be him. After all, the legend of Ray Lion had been firmly implanted into their minds for years already. But Lionel didn't pay them any mind as he turned to Aina. It's good stuff, though it won't be very helpful for now. It's like the puppet master energy. Aina nodded, understanding without Lionel needing to explain further. Force that loosened one's future path as opposed to directly upgrading one's strength was the most sought after. Though Lionel hadn't bothered to ask the dictionary about it, this sort of force was extraordinarily rare and could only usually be found after killing variant invalids. This fact alone should prove the level of rarity assigned to this force. A force named Life's Breath. It was the rawest and truest form of life elemental force. And the fact that it was appearing in the variant zone of a fifth-dimensional bronze organization just went to show that this place had evolved far beyond what even Valiant Heart knew it to be. Ignoring everyone else, Aina and Lionel walked forward together. Realizing that this hall would likely be an endless road of battle, Aina brought out her battle axe, her light steps making it seem that this brazing of family heirloom had the weight of a feather when in reality, it was likely far heavier than even Lionel's heavy domain spear. Before the group could react to the movement of the couple, they had already taken down the next two guardians and had already moved on. It feels good. Aina said softly after crushing the orb and allowing the force to enter her. You can't just casually say that kind of stuff now. Lionel said seriously. Someone might take it the wrong way. Aina turned and gave Lionel a glare, but all she found was a man trying his best to stop his lips from twitching. Aina's current voice was really too seductive. Anything she said could easily be taken out of context. Yet, simultaneously, she had a presence no one dared to blaspheme. It was an eerie combination that could drive a man wild. Luckily for Lionel, he didn't mind looting his own girlfriend, even if she did have the presence of an empress. The one thing Lionel would never feel is inferior, he had always pursued Aina with his head held high. If she was an empress, he would be an emperor. Plus, someone had to put a baby in the empress, right? Of course it should be him. At that moment, the others seemed to have recovered, presenting a new problem to the group. With only 2 guardians appearing each time, but there being 12 of them, how exactly would they decide who battled? The logical choice would be that since practically everyone aside from Radlys and Sarieth had come in pairs of 2, they should allow a rotation of 6 with each pair getting a shot. But this sort of logical and fair route, would it really be accepted? Lionel had thought of it long ago, but he already knew it would be rejected by Raylion and Hephaestus, so why would he waste his breath? As for majority rule, that only worked on the weak and those who thought of themselves as weak. And obviously, Raylion and Hephaestus wouldn't think of themselves in this way. As expected, when Lionel and Aina made it to the line of the third pair of guardians, a sharp wind pierced toward their backs. The couple simultaneously each took a step to the side, separating from each other by a measure as an arrow soared between their shoulders and splintered the forehead of a guardian in 2. Lionel sent a casual look back to find a young man with features he seemed to recognize grabbing an orb out of the air. However, though Lionel recognized his features, he didn't recognize the man himself. Family member? Cousin? Most likely sibling. Balthorn. Lionel's mind completed the circuit in a split moment and realized that this person must be an elder brother of Balthorn's. And, from the looks of it, he was a member of Bear Rose. For some reason, though he was clearly the vice leader, the leader, a petite young woman only tall enough to reach his shoulder, seemed to differ to him. In fact, this Bear Rose leader was among those struggling against the mountain pass pressure. Lionel couldn't help but be intrigued by this dynamic. Chapter 746. Chapter 746, Glass Dome. The arrow that had soared by Lionel and Aina suddenly rose back up and shot back, landing in Balthorn's elder brother's palm as though it had always been there. Telekinesis? No. This is a bit different from that. The control was specifically on the arrow tip. There's no reason for that unless what he can control is limited to metal and metal alone. Thinking back to Balthorn and her control over those massive and heavy steel balls, Lionel came to a realization. It was either that these siblings just so happened to awaken similar abilities, or this was related to the lineage factor of their family. It had to be remembered that the awakening of abilities was completely random. It was a gift given by the universe and technically gave those with weak backgrounds a chance to rise up. As such, there was no shortage of individuals from powerful families who awoke abilities that were completely useless. In fact, Lionel had fought his fair share of battles where the losing party didn't use their ability even when a loss was imminent. It's clear that in that situation, it wouldn't be a matter of hiding one's trump card, but rather a case where this trump card was useless. The most common abilities were low-level boosts to one's physical attributes like strength or speed or eyesight or maybe hearing. Not all abilities had all the fancy bells and whistles Sail's ability did, and most weren't as useful as Lionel's despite not having a tangible form. From Lionel's deduction, Balthorn was likely born with a useless ability, which was why she didn't use it even when her life was on the line against the Titan hyena. As for her brother, well, his control over their lineage factor was clearly much greater and had a much greater range. But only time would tell if his ability was useless. Or rather it would if Lionel hadn't already used the dictionary to check everyone's ability and knew for a fact that his ability was indeed useless. But his sharpened eyesight most definitely helped with his archery. At that moment the second guardian fell. But this one was taken by Raylion, who had still not shattered his first orb. The tension in the group seemed to reach another level. No one seemed eager to allow Lionel and Aina to continue leading the group, but no one wanted to stand too close to each other either. Unfortunately, in such a tense atmosphere one couldn't possibly expect peace to last for long, and that it didn't. It didn't even take much time at all. When the group reached the fourth pair of guardians, hell erupted. The moment they appeared, the leader of Severed Heart, a man with an expression that seemed carved out of the purest ice cold, took action swiftly, a spear of lightning appearing before him and tearing a path toward the guardian. However, at that same instant, Sail seemed to want to make a move as well. Her wrist manifested several swirling petals. But, instead of becoming her melee weapons like last time, she seemed to have evolved them to become capable projectiles. The path of the lightning spear and seemingly dainty petals crashed, resulting in an explosion that ended up not injuring even a hair on the guardians. At that same instant, Balthorn's elder brother moved again, but his action was impeded by Hephaestus, who also seemed to want in. But Hephaestus didn't have any long-ranged attacks, so he directly deflected the Bear Rose Vice leader's arrows before grabbing it out of the air. Clearly not willing to let such a thing slide, Balthorn's brother let loose a rain of arrows, not giving Hephaestus a chance in the slightest. In an instant, though only 4 were fighting, it essentially placed 8 in a deadlock. Though the petite girl by Balthorn's brother hadn't moved yet, one would think that she wasn't as simple as she looked, especially since Raylion had yet to take action. At the same time, Severed Heart's vice leader was glaring daggers at Sail's companion, seemingly only waiting for an opportunity to tear him to shreds. Lionel watched all of this with a helpless expression while Sarieth and Radlease didn't seem amped to take action. Seeing Lionel's gaze from across the sparking lights of the battlefield, Radlease put 2 thumbs up, raising them to the sides of his pale face as he looked from Aina to Lionel and back again. Even though Aina was masked, he still couldn't help but click his tongue. This woman was truly too pristine. Lionel was left speechless by this Radlease once again. If it was anyone else ogling Aina like this, he'd probably send a few arrows their way. But this Radlease always seemed to be covered in a thin layer of fog. Lionel couldn't tell if he was serious or not. Up to this point, none of Radlease's actions seemed to add up. Lionel shook his head and chose to calmly observe the battle. Considering how long this corridor was, he was under no illusions that this would end any time soon. They might spend weeks, even months in this place. If they had to fight it out like this every time, it would take even longer. So, Lionel was under no illusions that he had to save everyone. These people were aware of the dangers and they were still fighting. He wasn't their babysitter. If some got eliminated early here, it would be better for the atmosphere of the group. The best he could do for them was if one was close to dying, he would just throw them into a snow globe to give them a chance. That was the best his kindness could give them right now. Lionel's eyes began to wander. Even though his senses remained trained on the battlefield in case anything untoward could happen, he found that this hall was far more fascinating than he gave it credit for. Lionel's pupils suddenly constricted. The glass dome above them had originally been flooded with sunlight. But, the moment the hall went dark, only illuminating a small light around the bronze statues, the sunlight had also disappeared. But now, with the sun gone, Lionel was suddenly able to see subtle patterns that the bright lights had obscured before. Those patterns? Lionel flipped over a palm, bringing out a familiar ring. But, what he hadn't expected was that the moment he did, he vanished, leaving just 11 youths behind. Chapter 747? Chapter 747, What the? Aina's eyes widened. Her hand subconsciously reached out to grab at Lionel. But by the time she had reacted and moved, her palm could only touch at empty air. Her brows creased beneath her mask, confusion coloring her face. There was nothing that Lionel kept from Aina. On the days they spent together, they meandered through conversation that usually lasted hours at a time. It could be said that the only thing Lionel had never told Aina were the words his coach had spoken on that day. This was all to say that Aina had long since been aware of the existence of the ring and had just seen Lionel pull it out while no one was paying attention. Knowing this, though still worried about Lionel's safety, it wasn't to the point that Aina was plunged into a well of despair. After she took a deep breath, practically hypnotizing herself into believing that Lionel would be fine, she looked up, her eyes several shades colder than they were just a moment ago. If she had to face the 10 who remained alone and without a partner, that was fine too. In her heart, though, she couldn't shed a last stubborn and sinking feeling. However, this just filled her with the will to vent, and she definitely wouldn't be as merciful as Lionel. As Aina was panicking, one could only imagine what Lionel was feeling. Fuck. Send me back. Lionel's roar bellowed into a wide expanse of sky. Worry for himself? He never felt it. But the idea of leaving Aina behind in that cesspool of human angst and ambition made his heart feel as though it was being lit on fire. General? Lionel's head snapped in the direction of the voice only to realize that he was seated on a steed in the middle of a 1,000-strong army. His roar that shook the skies seemed to have awakened them all. However, the words Lionel spoke make the dreary atmosphere even worse. Even the general knew that this was a losing battle. Why should they even bother to fight? Shouldn't they just lay down their arms and give up now? Lionel's rage had yet to dissipate. At first, he really didn't have the mind to care who was calling out to him or if he was even being called out to at all. He had never thought the simple act of taking out the ring would result in this. To make matters worse, it was now stuck on his finger and he couldn't even take it off if he wanted. However, Lionel soon realized that he had to calm down. No amount of roaring or rage was going to make this ring magically pop off, nor did this world seem prepared to listen to him. It was only after Lionel reached this infuriating conclusion that he finally decided to look around. The army he stood within was indeed 1,000 strong. However, there wasn't a single unifying identity to them in the slightest. In fact, they looked like nothing more than a group of ruffians. If they were holding hoes and plows, Lionel could easily mistake them for farmers rather than the warriors they were supposed to be. Beyond that, the horses they rode, if they could be called that at all, looked as though they had been starved for several weeks. They had discolored patches of skin, their ribs were visible through their dull coats, and their legs seemed several measures too thin. Was this supposed to be a cavalry? Weren't they better off on foot? Lionel had hardly finished this thought when his internal sight swept over the men once more. It was only then that he realized that beneath their cobbled-together armor was sunken skin, malnutrition, and a vulnerability so keen they could hardly withstand the heft of their own weapons. What the hell is this? General? Lionel looked over to the source of the voice, only to find out that this person was indeed talking to him. He seemed to be a young man no older than Lionel himself. He had a nervous look hidden within his blue eyes, but his hands gripped at his sword so hard his veins threatened to burst. Lionel could see an almost pleading look in the eyes of this young man. Whereas the others only had fear, this young man had a small bit of hope. Gazing around once more, Lionel realized that of the army, only this young man stood almost level to him. Though he was a half-step back as a sign of respect, he was nearly shoulder to shoulder with Lionel. Right-hand man? Lieutenant maybe? Lionel's brows furrowed. Before he could truly understand, a rumbling began to sound in the distance. Though they were several kilometers away, they still seemed capable of making the ground quake. Their presence alone plunged Lionel's army into a deeper bout of despair. Though they were so far away, with the improvement of his internal sight, Lionel could easily see them. What he saw, though, made him sigh. Compared to their army, this one was leagues above. Though they didn't have high-class and shimmering armor, their weapons were well kept, their steeds were well fed, and their bodies bolstered a strong health that rippled through their muscles. As though that wasn't enough, their numbers were double their own. I need to get out of this place as quickly as possible. At that moment, Lionel's spear appeared with a flip of his palm as he jumped down from his horse. This sort of steed would only hinder him, not to mention the fact he hated riding horses. Did you hear me? Lionel's sudden roar shook the warriors to his back again. If this is the kind of heart you want to show, that kind of spineless, cowering, effeminate garbage, just send me back, I want no part of it. But, if you want to be men, if you want to defend your lands and protect your women and children, then raise your weapons. Lionel's roar echoed through the valley. On either side of them, tall walls of rock stood. There wasn't a single place to go but forwards or backwards. However, backward is where their homes lay, it was where those they loved and cherished rested. Going backwards was not an option. The gaze of the blue-eyed youth shimmered. Forward. Lionel roared, charging ahead, his body wrapped in golden light. If one looked upon the valley from above, it would feel as though one was watching a blazing laser of gold tear a path forward. It felt as though Lionel could cross hundreds of meters in the blink of an eye. His speed was undeniable, but his momentum was even higher. What are you all waiting for? Charge. The blue-eyed youth rose his weapon into the air, pointing it forward and kicking the side of his horse. The army surged forward like a tide. They had poor coordination and their formation was faulty, but at the very least, a fire burned in their eyes. Lionel's back was like a fuel that lit their bellies. As for Lionel himself, though, he was inwardly shaking his head, wondering how he had gotten himself into this mess. As amped up as the soldiers following behind Lionel were, he himself just wanted to end this battle as quickly as possible, hoping that this would send him out. Unfortunately, no matter how powerful Lionel felt that he was now, he really wasn't confident in taking down 2,000 warriors at the same time, especially since they were all in the fourth dimension. The only reason Lionel shot ahead on his own like this wasn't because he could do it alone, it was because he was the only one strong enough to disrupt this army's formation before they reached his men. If he didn't, this well-trained army would run through his like a knife through butter. Lionel shook his head. Is this another zone? Why would it teleport me here? What the hell does it have to do with the ring? Lionel really couldn't fathom just what was happening. However, he had also never been in a zone that could be continuously reopened for the sake of training future generations. That said, the zone should still fundamentally follow its original purpose, right? A variant zone was supposed to be a zone that allowed those who entered to benefit from things in the future. It appeared when a world was on the brink of collapse in order to give it a chance. Plus, this time, rather than coming in as himself, Lionel seemed to have been loaded in as some sort of pre-designed character. This wasn't how it had been before at all. However, what did this have to do with that ring? And what was maybe even more mind-boggling was how Senior Lu got his hands on this ring to begin with. Lionel had to be very cautious with investigating Senior Lu's background. After all, why would he be making such inquiries if there wasn't anything suspicious going on? But he hadn't been able to catch anyone snooping around after his disappearance. That made Lionel conclude just one thing. Maybe Senior Lu really had only stumbled into some luck, only to end up benefiting Lionel in the end? But was this even a benefit? Lionel didn't even want to be here. Damn it. Scan this place. How the hell do I get out of here? By now, Lionel was just a kilometer from the charging army, his annoyance becoming more and more palpable. Ping. Subdimensional zone detected, Valiant Heart. Subdimensional zone grade, Quasi-Silver, clear requirements, Valiant Heart, side quest, Valiant Heart, side quest, Valiant Heart, hidden quest, Valiant Heart, ping. Seed is warned to be wary of Valiant Heart. Lionel almost tripped over and fell. What the fuck was this? Chapter 748. Chapter 748, sorry, Lionel didn't have time to make sense of what he was hearing. He subconsciously felt that even if he had all the time in the world, it still wouldn't matter. Somewhere deep inside, he subconsciously felt that his father was playing another practical joke on him. But how could his dad possibly know that he would stumble into such a ring and be teleported to this place? Senior Lu was too insignificant of a character to be predicted by anyone, and maybe this was simply what some called fate. Practical joke or not, though, all Lionel knew was that the dictionary had lost its usefulness in this situation. He could only hope that he could finish things quickly, or that the time dilation here bordered on excessive. He couldn't afford to be here for as long as he had been in the Camelot zone. Lionel's figure flickered, his 4-meter-long wind spear following in a stream behind his strike. The opposing army seemed stunned that a single man had led the charge all on his own. And, in fact, Lionel's supposed right-hand man was also beginning to panic. Though he had wanted Lionel to be fired up and lead the army well, this was a bit too much, no? However, it was already too late to call him back. The blue-eyed youth hesitated. Trying to call Lionel back now would dampen the momentum of the army by a considerable bit. But, at the same time, wouldn't Lionel's death be even worse? Gritting his teeth, the eye lieutenant made a decision. However, just as he opened his mouth to speak, the situation abruptly changed once again. Illusory wings spread to Lionel's back. As though the golden image of a heavenly rock, his speed increased explosively. In one instant he was still 100 kilometers from the opposing army. In the next he had appeared above their general, his spear jetting out like a meteor. The opposing general couldn't even react before a spear had split through his brows. The battlefield fell into silence for just a moment. But that was quickly ended by an explosion of fire that lit the air aflame. The opposing general's head combusted until all that was left was ash. Lionel landed on the general's still running steed, his steps unexpectedly light. His motion to kick the opposing general off before landing was so seamless that the horse didn't even seem to realize that its owner had already been slaughtered. Lionel raised his head up to the sky and roared, billowing flames jetting out from his mouth as though to signal his victory. His army was stunned for a moment before they erupted. Their blood boiling to the absolute limit, they saw nothing but red. Their own roars echoed through the valley, their charge suddenly gaining organization and purpose. It was then that a slaughter was released. The battle ended not even an hour later. With Lionel leading the charge and taking on much of the pressure, they managed to survive. However, there was only so far motivation could get an army. Despite the victory, Lionel lost at least 50% of his men, leaving barely 500 remaining. And though he expected the result to be like this, he was still very much in this world with no sign of getting out. Sighing deeply, Lionel shook his head. Gather the scattered horses, don't let them run far. Those that are able-bodied will become our new war horses. Those that are too injured to be of use will be slaughtered and used for food. Other than this, take spoils as you please. This army was clearly lacking in food and equipment. Though this was a hard-fought battle and they had lost many, it ironically guaranteed that everyone would gain a large upgrade in this regard. Using the carriages the opposing army had brought along, they began to organize their loot. However, this was undertaken only after they dealt with their dead, giving each man a proper burial. Even though Lionel wanted to leave this place as quickly as possible, he couldn't help but feel the weight of these deaths. Ever since he had entered the Mayan zone, Lionel had never been able to separate the lives from a zone to those in real life. To him, whether the past, future or present, these were all people. He couldn't help but feel that maybe he had been too rash. Maybe he should have thought of a different plan, a different approach that would have ended in more surviving. Logic told him that with the army already in the valley and the enemies charging forth, there was no other course of action to be taken. But emotion seemed to rage through his heart. He was supposedly intelligent, right? Why hadn't he even tried to think of anything else? And the truth was that he knew the answer to this. He knew exactly why he threw the lives of these men away without caring to look for another way. It was Aina. He was so worried about his own loved one that he neglected to care about the fact that these men had their own girlfriends, their own wives, their own children and mothers and fathers, friends and grandparents, dreams and aspirations. Lionel clenched his fists, his jaw steeling. When they all finally returned to the small town they all called home, it hit Lionel like a ton of bricks. Walls of women and children stood anxiously at the gates. They flooded the outer town limits, many of them camping and even more staying completely awake, unable to sleep until they laid eyes on their lovers, their husbands, their fathers. When they saw the army return in victory, a cheer that shook the town resounded. The walls quaked and the ground trembled. However, when the number they expected to return was reduced by half, the wails and cries were just as resounding. This sweeping sorrow, flooding the town like a monsoon, crashed through Lionel's heart in waves. Chapter 749. Chapter 749. Small home. The men and women of this town had all been prepared to die. The threat they faced was too great and they were simply too weak. They knew that they should be happy simply for the sake of surviving, they should be grateful, thanking their lucky stars that they could see another day. However, how could pain be washed away by logic? General? The blue-eyed youth always stood silently by Lionel's side. Seeing him blankly staring at the pain and grief before him, he couldn't help but check up on him. Oh? Lionel absent-mindedly responded, his gaze never shifting. There was a little girl over there, no more than 7 years old, clutching the blood-stained scabbard her father had left home with. Not far from her there was a woman. She had a young and youthful face. Though she wasn't extraordinarily beautiful, she was very pretty, maybe even the prettiest within this small, malnourished town. Yet tears streamed down her face endlessly, her sobs echoing as she grasped onto a necklace that hung from her neck with both hands. With every quiver her body made in her fit of sorrow, her dress shifted in the wind, making the baby bump she sported all the more obvious. On another side there was an elderly couple. The old woman with deep gray hair trembled in her husband's arms, her tears getting lost in the folds of her wrinkles. The eyes of the two were already murky with age, but they clutched their son's leather armor between the two of them, their fragile bodies seemingly ready to be blown over by the wind. Lionel's senses were too sharp. He didn't miss a single story of grief, a single cry of pain, not a single tear, not a single quiver. It was all seared into his mind and stored in a place he would never forget, leaving a mark he could never ignore. The blue-eyed youth sighed again. The pain they experienced would have been far worse if not for you, General. Lionel didn't respond. Was that the metric he should be using? Especially when just hours ago he didn't even spare the lives and deaths of these people a single thought. Once again logic seemed to tell him one matter, while his heart pulled him toward another. Lionel wanted to roar into the skies, but he knew that even if he did, he wouldn't be able to vent his rage in the slightest. Suddenly, Lionel felt a tight grip on his wrist. He looked down to find that his blue-eyed right-hand man had grabbed onto him. Come on, General. I can't let you wallow away in another bar all night after saving our asses. They'll take you to meet my girl, you haven't met her yet, right? The blue-eyed youth beamed. Lionel forced a smile and allowed himself to be pulled along. He didn't know what he should be doing in this world, but he knew that wallowing in self-pity wasn't it. Plus, the youth continued, our esteemed general can't be the only one without a proper home to be greeted by, right? How embarrassing would that be? The blue-eyed youth's laughter seemed to want to fill Lionel's soul with light and hope. The two entered the town, traveling through its streets. Lionel noticed the shabby roads, the half-broken homes, the filth and the poverty. It seemed that whether they camped out at the town's entrance or not, the living conditions of these people truly wasn't that much better. In fact, they might have been better off living in nature. However, what Lionel did notice was a large building at the center of the town. Compared to everywhere else, it was almost like a heaven, unblemished by the trash of this world. He couldn't help but wonder just what it was. Soon, though, the blue-eyed youth led Lionel to a modest little home of stone and wood. It's nothing much, but I managed to secure it with our military salary. That sum you lent me? This is what it went into. The two entered the small home only to hear a sudden cry. Rollin. A blur of blue leapt into the blue-eyed youth's arms. When this blur cleared, it became obvious that it was a petite youth lady who was about the same age as the two leaders of the town's army. Seeing her, Lionel realized that there was a hidden flower of this town. It seemed that Rollin was quite a lucky man. At the same time, Lionel felt relieved to finally know this young man's name. With how familiar they apparently were with one another, it would have been too embarrassing if Lionel had to ask. Elise, come. Rollin beamed. This is our general and my very best friend. Lionel smiled in greeting. My manners. Elise politely curtsied, her dress spreading outward that a blooming flower. I was just getting preparations for dinner finished. In just about half an hour, everything should be finished. There's more than enough for a +1. With those words done, as though a little bundle of energy, Elise skipped off to the kitchen under Roland's delighted laughter. Lionel suddenly felt a great peace observing this small home. Though he still felt like a third-party observer to this world, he couldn't help but think of how nice it would be if he and Aina could have such a life. If she never had to go through such trauma as a child, if she never lost her mother, if her father never disappeared, would they be able to be together like this? In a home they called their own, cooking side by side, laughing and joking with one another without a care in the world? He truly wanted this. But he also knew how important revenge for her mother was to Aina. He knew that it gripped her and consumed her every waking moment. Maybe such a peaceful life they were never destined for. An hour later, as the trio was exchanging banter over a warm dinner, a heavy, almost obnoxious knocking came from the door. What was more shocking, though, was that this person didn't wait for the door to be answered. Rather, it was very soon broken from its hinges. Chapter 750? Chapter 750. Yes, the house was very small to begin with. It only had a single room, a single bathroom, and the dining room, living space, and kitchen could all be considered to be one cobbled-together homogeneous zone. This was all to say that the trio had a very clear line of sight to the door. And it was even more to say that it wouldn't have taken any of them more than 5 seconds to reach and open it. Could there really be anything so important that it couldn't wait 5 seconds? Lionel frowned. The moment the door crashed down, a large figure stomped in. No, maybe it was more accurate to say that this person looked quite large because of the heavy and somewhat flowery armor they wore. Though their massive belly wasn't helping. Lionel had seen his fair share of warriors to this point, and there were some who could have large bellies and still be explosive athletes and powerful soldiers. Lionel's own teammates were among them. His offensive linemen were essentially his bodyguards, and in terms of strength, at least before the metamorphosis, Lionel couldn't match up to a half of them. However, Lionel could immediately tell that this person was most definitely not a warrior of any kind. The armor they wore seemed to be lined with force arts that gave his frail body the capability to move around and even exhibit the strength he just had to break down the door. This alone made it impressive. But this alone didn't make this person worthy of fear. And yet, the instant this individual appeared, Rollin and Elise shot up from their seats, saluting seriously. Even after several moments, they didn't dare to raise their heads. The fat, armored maid scanned the small home with a clear disdain painting across the narrowed slits of his eyes. From the beginning, he didn't even care to check that everyone was showing him his due respect. After all, he already expected it. Was there even a need to question? His Lordship Helis has demanded the presence of the general. He questions why it is that an hour has passed since your return, yet there has still been no formal report sent to his lordship's manor? It was only after speaking out words that seemed squeezed from the mouth of a weasel that the fat, armored man turned to the dining room table. At first, he nodded in satisfaction when he saw that Rollin and Elise still had their heads lowered in a deep bow. But his face froze when he realized that Lionel was still sitting at his seat, his gaze scanning him up and down as though observing something inconsequential. At that moment, Lionel stood. It seems that I will have to come back a later time. Thank you for your hospitality. The fat, armored man trembled with rage. But when Lionel took a step toward him, he suddenly felt like a towering giant. Roland's expression changed. Though his head was still lowered, he had known Lionel all his life. That tone of his voice made it obvious that he was angry. You wouldn't go and do something foolish, right? Roland's expression changed. He wanted to call out, but if he did so, he might turn whatever wrath would be aimed toward Lionel, toward him and his wife as well. Roland hesitated. However, in the end he gritted his teeth. Raising his head before he received an okay from the fat, armored man, he stepped forward and grabbed Lionel's arm seriously. Lionel was stunned. When he looked back and into Roland's eyes, he couldn't help but shiver. That look. He hadn't seen it in a long time. It was different from the reliance and trust Lionel had experienced that day after he saved the freshman. No, it was a look of willingness to walk through the fires of hell together. A look Lionel had only seen from the few brothers he trusted the most in this life. Don't, Roland said firmly. Lionel stayed silent for a long while. It was at the moment Roland thought that he had gotten through to him that Lionel suddenly lashed out, punching Roland squarely in the jaw and sending him sprawling to the floor. Elise's small shriek sounded as she watched her husband tumble to the ground. Lionel fixed his sleeve as though washing Roland's dirty hands away and walked up to the fat, armored brute. Hurry up, Lionel barked. You. Before the fat man could say anything more, Lionel was already standing less than a step from him. It felt at that moment that thought Lionel was only a head taller, he might as well have been 10. It was like a mountain was weighing down on him from above. Fearing for his life, the fat man could only turn back, a sinister light flashing in his eyes. It was almost as though he could already see the image of Lionel's demise. It wasn't long before the small home fell into an eerie quiet. Elise scrambled to her husband's side, tears falling uncontrollably down her delicate cheeks. Why did he do this? Elise entered a state of half-hysteria. The mixture of fear and seeing her love hurt like this left her not knowing how to react or feel. Elise was quite a naive and pure young woman. She didn't seem to understand the danger of war, or she at least chose to be relentlessly optimistic about it. Why else would she be waiting with dinner prepared for Roland while practically everyone else felt that the town was finished? Yet, because Roland told her his best friend, the general, would most definitely succeed, she believed his word and even began to almost deify Lionel as well. But now, Roland sighed deeply, wiping the blood from his lip. Don't blame him. He did this for our sake. A flash of determination lit Roland's gaze. He reached out and grabbed his wife's hand. Elise, are you willing to be with me in life and in death? Elise froze when she heard these words, but soon her tears came spilling forward even faster than before. She buried herself in her husband's arms, but her words were surprisingly clear and firm. Yes. Chapter 751. Chapter 751. Crest. Lionel wasn't very surprised when he was led to the manor he saw in the distance previously. However, he still couldn't help but watch as the streets became cleaner, more well-paved, better kept. It was as though he was slowly traveling into a new world, step by step. The houses grew larger, more elaborate. Guards began to show their presence more and more often. The number of luxuries seemed to skyrocket with every street he passed by. The most common marker of this wealth was weight. Overweight women and men seemed to be everywhere, chatting idly, drinking things the poor could never get and spitting out food the poor could never taste. Then there was the holy grail of them all. The manor was 4 stories tall and just its front face was 50 meters long from end to end. At its doors, true guards stood, wearing the same armor as the fat man by Lionel's side. Except, these guards were actually powerful enough that Lionel's patience fell by another measure the more of them he saw. Where were these strong warriors when they fought that battle? Where had this equipment and armor they wore been? It can't be that they stood here this entire time to protect a manor that was dozens of miles from the battlefield, right? His lordship has requested the general's presence. The fat man spoke to the guards. Seemingly recognizing this man's identity, even some of the guards gave him looks of disdain. But toward these kind of people, Lionel didn't particularly care if they sided with him or not. Ultimately, were they not here while men much weaker than them, far less trained and far less fed fought in their stead? Who were they to feel disdain toward anybody? Lionel's emotions fluctuated slightly. The moment his foot reached the top step, the marble cracked and splintered. But he continued walking as though nothing had happened, passing by the guards without a greeting. Long after his back had disappeared into the manor, the fat, armored man forgetting to follow, the cold sweat that covered the backs of the guards could practically form a pool. The inside of the manor was as luxurious as one might expect. But each and every item Lionel laid eyes on caused his mind to flash to another undernourished soldier, another poor steed they were forced to ride, another blunt sword they were forced to swing, another weeping family member that was forced to grieve. Lionel didn't need anyone to guide him. With his internal sight, the entire layout of the manor had already been reflected in his mind. With large strides, he pushed open 2 large wooden double doors to be greeted by an elaborate feast. If there was ever an incarnation of gluttony, Lionel felt that he had found it. Just for the sake of feeding what amounted to just 8 people, there were numerous large bird and beasts, endless piles of fruit, 2 cakes that were at least a meter tall each, pitchers of juice that could all fill their own table. The spread was practically endless, each dish having an assigned servant of their own. Lionel could tell at a glance by the speed and pace these 8 men and women ate their food with that it would be impossible for them to finish it all. Of the food they tasted, large amounts of meat remained on the bone, sandwiches lay with a bite or 2 taken out of them, juice cups were swapped between with the nourishing fluids within having been forgotten. Every detail Lionel laid his eyes on made his expression calmer and calmer. Eventually he became so placid that he didn't even seem to exist anymore. As a result, no one seemed to notice he was here for several long seconds, allowing him the time he needed to thoroughly imprint everything he saw into his memory. "Ah, General. I'm quite disappointed." One of the 8 men began to speak, a half-finished chicken leg still being worked on by him. "Though you won this battle, I am not a very patient man. Not only was there no report of spoils given to me, my own general didn't appear and made we wait over an hour before I was forced to send an attendee to retrieve him. What do you think a lord like me is to do with such disobedient subordinates?" Lionel didn't respond as he stood at the doorway. "Jem?" The lord looked up from his food to see Lionel wasn't even looking at him. Rather, Lionel was looking up at a crest that hung from the wall. It was quite beautiful, truly. At the forefront, there was a silver shield with the image of a roaring lion etched onto it. To its back there were 2 spears crossed, exuding a valiant aura of dominance. Across the bottom, a fluttering ribbon of words written in an odd ancient language with rune-like lettering could be found. Yet, Lionel somehow understood what it said perfectly. The valiance of a warrior. The heart of a protector. The words seemed to resonate with Lionel. But he only felt more and more disgusted when he realized it was painted onto the wall of a person who couldn't understand its meaning. Or maybe he did understand it, and simply didn't care. Boy, did you not hear the words of his lordship? Have you nothing to? The shrill voice of an obese woman was cut short by Lionel's spear in her throat. The sound of a struggling gurgle brought the place to a halting silence before the screams of the attendees suddenly sounded through the hall. The guards manning the walls suddenly sprung into action, leaping for Lionel. But they were dispatched with just as much ease, the last gaze they had of the world being those sharp, cold eyes. Lionel killed the gluttons one by one. In what felt like just a few seconds he stood before the Lord. Grabbing his fat neck, Lionel raised him up from his seat. Foul smells began to waft off of the Lord. One part came from his poor hygiene, but the others definitely came from him soiling himself. What? You can't kill me. I was appointed by His Majesty himself. Lionel's spear shot through his heart. He watched on coldly as the Lord slowly bled out, his gaze becoming more chilling with each passing moment. Chapter 752. Chapter 752 Silence. Lionel watched as the corpses fell before him. The screams of the attendees and the subsequent commotion of the manor all shook the city, yet he didn't seem to be able to hear anything. He stared at Lord Helly's body as it slowly bled out before him. Even now, the man struggled to gasp and gurgle, his gradually dimming eyes still filled with shock. Even as he died, he couldn't fathom the idea of someone killing him, he couldn't wrap his head around how someone beneath him, someone he had appointed, no less, could possibly treat him in this way. When Helly's took his last, struggling breath, Lionel turned and walked out of the dining room, his gaze still suffused with coldness. Walking down the hallways, there were some guards who simply charged by him despite the fact he still wielded a bloody spear. Maybe in their minds, they still couldn't wrap their heads around the idea of someone attacking their lord either. So, when they heard such commotion and alarm, their first reaction was to understand the situation before taking action. As for the few guards with sense enough to realize that these matters were definitely related to Lionel, they received a whipping spear to the side of their heads, causing their brains to rattle within their skulls. The commotion of the city continued to grow. However, it soon became obvious to Lionel that not all of it was caused by himself. There was most definitely something else going on. But even Lionel was shocked when he stepped out of the manor doors to find the source. At that moment, Lionel stood at the top of the manor's marbled steps, his position unwittingly being right above the cracks his own feet had caused earlier. Down below there was an accumulating surge. One would have thought that this was the result the movements of the Majesty Helly's mentioned before his death. But Lionel knew that such a thing was far too quick. He had no idea who this Majesty was, but what he did know was that they couldn't possibly be so close by and things couldn't possibly be so coincidental. When the surge got closer, though, even Lionel couldn't help but be stunned. He was correct. It really wasn't this so-called Majesty. But the source was potentially even more shocking. A hodgepodge of men and women, even some Lionel would deem as children, all pushed through and into the noble district. Without a care for the risk to their lives, they clashed against the patrolling guards, their rage palpable. Compared to the shimmering armor of the guards they faced, their equipment was shabby. Many of them ran along with their bare feet, unable to afford shoes. Most wore rags that could barely cover their bodies. Some gripped makeshift weapons or kitchen knives so awkwardly that it became clear they had never done such a thing in their lives before. At the helm of this army was a young man Lionel recognized all too well. Even from so far away, Lionel could see the fury and determination that lit his eyes. But what was maybe even more heart-stopping was the fact his petite little wife followed right by his side. She too wielded nothing but a kitchen knife, probably due to the fact any other weapon would have been too heavy for her. Her face was the picture of nervousness crossed with resolve, but the tears that simultaneously fell from her cheeks made Lionel's coldness dissipate somewhat, an involuntary chuckle escaping his lips. This wasn't because he was laughing at Elise's weakness. Rather, he felt as though he was watching his little sister try her best to open a jar with her tiny hands. She squeezed and grunted, putting in all the effort her small body allowed. However, it only resulted in sniveling tears that made one want to protect her with all their heart. The resolve for such a woman to enter a battlefield like this one was beyond Lionel's range of understanding. He didn't even know if he himself had such resolve. But what he knew for certain was that if he was Roland, he most definitely wouldn't have the resolve that would be needed to march into enemy territory with his wife by his side like this, knowing that he couldn't possibly guarantee his ability to protect her. Was Roland wrong for doing this? Lionel felt that the answer was too complicated. He had no idea. On the one hand, one had a duty as a husband. To protect one's wife, one's children, one's family. In a lot of ways, keeping them out of danger in the first place was part of this responsibility. But on another, Roland had a duty to himself, to continue to be that man his wife fell in love with, that man of pride and honor, of sacrifice and valiance. If he hid his family away and ignored all of this, could he have continued to do that? And then there was a third perspective. Didn't one also have the duty to bring about the best life one could for one's family? If the world you experienced every day could be considered to be nothing but a living hell, a place where endless suffering was abound and every minute your family spent within it was more heartache than anything else, what would you do? Would you still have to protect the status quo? Would you still be doing your duty as a husband, a father, if you allowed your family to continue to exist in such a world? Where was the line? Which duty should you be most loyal to? Was safety the most important? Were your ideals the most important? Or was happiness the most important? As Roland continued to lead the charge, his every step was like a hammer on Lionel's heart. When the flood of makeshift warriors finally made it to the manor, they all looked up toward Lionel who hadn't moved an inch, and Lionel looked back toward them. A silence hung over them all. Even though the city still seemed to be alight with blaring alarms and screaming nobles, it still seemed quiet to them for some reason. Chapter 753. Chapter 753. 3 months feeling their gazes was more than just that. It wasn't like what one would experience standing before a crowd and being expected to give a well-thought-out speech. No, it was far heavier than that. As though the burden of their hopes and dreams had suddenly been settled onto his shoulders, as though he was their light-bearer, as though he was their only hope. It was a different kind of weight, one that would definitely crush the heart and soul of any man unworthy of it all. Roland stood down below, holding onto the small, trembling hand of his wife. His blue eyes seemed to pierce through the space between them, landing on Lionel with a burning light, an endless fervor. He looked from Lionel's face to the bloodied, for-meter-long spear in his hand. The crimson liquid dripped slowly from its tip, rebounding off of the marbled steps. The sound, slow and rhythmic, beat along with their hearts. "This is your choice?" Lionel asked. In return, silence was all he received. "All right then." The crowd of commoners erupted, their roars and cheers surging through the small town like a torrential wave. For the first time, the nobles began to feel some fear of their own, none of them daring to so much as peek out from their windows. Over a month later, in a distant city that dwarfed the small town in size and stature, a man with a graying beard sat upon a throne, listening to a report expressionlessly. Though his beard was indeed graying, rather than giving him the look of an old, out-of-his-prime man, it instead gave him an air of wisdom and confidence, even bolstering his looks to a level that could only be matched by other refined middle-aged men. "Your Majesty, Heli's death has been confirmed. According to reports, he lost his life at the hands of his general. Since then, the town has been gathered beneath the rulership of the general and has even begun to rapidly expand. Rather than continuing to defend the border as they're meant to, they've turned their weapons toward the capital and have been steadily eating away at our territory. At this point, 7 towns and 2 cities have already fallen." The king listened to this matter without much of a change in expression. However, the court ministers around him already began to bluster and rage before he himself got the chance to say anything. Bang! A man with a round belly smashed his fists down on an expensive wood railing. However, considering his stature and power, Lionel wouldn't conclude that he was useless in combat like he had for the other nobles. In fact, this man was definitely quite dangerous, carrying with him strength that could rock the earth. So much noble blood is on his hands. This scourge must be eradicated. Then why don't you go lead an army to stop him? Jem? Let him see what the esteemed Michael the Round can do? Michael shot a look of fury over. His title was Michael the Sturdy, not Round. It was clear that someone was trying to humiliate him. When he looked over and saw who it was, his fury only compounded. "You sure have a lot to say," Norman the cuckold. "How about you come over here and do it to my face?" Norman was of much smaller stature than Michael. Despite the fact he was in the king's presence, he had reclined back in his chair, his feet laying up on a similar wooden railing to the one Michael slammed. The only difference was that the two were on completely opposite sides of the royal court. Norman had long, flowing blonde hair and shimmering green eyes. Everything from the shape of his jaw to the outline of his nose could be considered to be at the peak of perfection. He was truly a handsome man amongst handsome men. Even though he was slouched and his figure wasn't clear, one had no doubt that he would match up in this aspect as well. Despite being insulted even more blatantly than Michael had been, Norman didn't react in nearly as enraged a fashion. In fact, he laughed as though the insult wasn't about him at all. Those who knew the story behind this could only show a range of reactions. Some shook their heads, some ignored the situation entirely, but the majority snickered. It was clear that amongst nobles, Norman wasn't well liked at all. And his next words proved exactly why that was. "Ah yes, my wife-to-be was indeed snatched away by His Majesty at the behest of his favorite son. What can I say? I simply did my duty. It's very amusing, even I laugh, I don't mind if you do. But, you know what I find even funnier? If any one of those nobles you're crying and moping about right now were here, would you even let them lick the dirt off the sole of your boots? Do you even really care about them? To you, mighty dukes and marquises, what are barons and earls worth? You only care because someone even lower than them is doing the slaughtering. It can't be that you're all unaware of the atrocities they've all committed at the border, right? Having such nobles defend such important and volatile parts of the land was a mistake to begin with. But you never cared then, so why do you care now? A failure all around, in my opinion." Norman yawned. In just about a minute he had said more than enough to warrant public execution 10 times over. He mentioned a taboo subject he wasn't meant to. He insulted the sovereignty of the nobles and as such the majesty who bestowed them this title. And finally he insulted His Majesty directly by calling his rulership and policies a failure. Why this man was still alive with such a nonchalant attitude was beyond them. 3 months. The voice came from nowhere. It carried a baritone kind of majesty that couldn't be ignored. Norman didn't bother to move as 2 heavy-set knights picked him up by the arms and began to drag him away. He really seemed too lazy to make any movements. His laughter rang through the courtroom. "See you all in 3 months." Chapter 754. Chapter 754. Alexander the Apex. A silence fell over the courtroom. No one dared to breathe a word. Even Michael, who should have been gloating, didn't dare to say a thing. In fact, he took his seat, regaining his silence as though nothing had happened. Their king, Alexander the Apex, was a man they all feared from the deepest recesses of their heart. When he spoke, the world listened. When he commanded, the world moved. However, sometimes his inaction was the scariest of all. It had already been 12 years since Norman's fiancée was snatched from him. In these 12 years, Norman had probably only met maybe a few weeks of them free, if that. In that time he had never been allowed to die, forced to watch as the love of his life became a tool for another man, and a weapon for a king to exercise his authority. By now, every outburst Norman had was like a plea to have his head lopped off, a hope that one day he would stumble upon a word combination so foul and so pointed that Alexander would finally have enough and put him to death. But each and every time, the king would remain unmoved, passing down a sentence of time without so much as blinking. Then he would continue about his duties as though absolutely nothing had happened, yet not a single person dared to say a word. It was as though all of them had been watching a session of torture for over a decade. The seed of fear planted within their hearts only seemed to grow with each passing day, a rational fear of their king being etched onto their souls. It took a special kind of sick and twisted person to so nonchalantly do what this king of theirs had done, and none of them dared to be the next. On a whim, their king had destroyed maybe the greatest talent their kingdom had ever seen in Norman, just for the sake of proving a point and asserting his dominance. Then, still not satisfied, he continued to torture this young man who had done absolutely nothing wrong simply so that they would never forget just what he was capable of. This sort of man. You shouldn't ever get on his bad side. Michael. Why yes, Your Majesty. Michael rocketed up to his feet, his belly seemingly made of steel as it didn't bounce even a single time. However, that didn't stop his attempt to keep his arms straight down his side from being laughable. You will lead the expedition. I want this matter handled. Do not bother to come back unless it is. Yes. "You're all dismissed," Alexander said emotionlessly. The king stood and left the courtroom, leaving Michael sweating buckets. The truth was that Michael didn't want this assignment. He had stood out for some brownie points to get some nobles on his side. However, the rumors of the rebel army were too striking to ignore. Of course, it wasn't that he feared Lionel. This was far from the truth. He felt that he could even crush Lionel with ease if that was all there was to it. The issue, though, was that many believed that these things weren't so simple. Before this rebellion began, there were reports of the enemy Oryx tribes making moves. Though they had only sent their human subordinates, it was definitely one of their stronger troops. Yet, somehow, this general and a ragtag group of commoners had defeated them? How could this not smell fishy? The consensus was that the Oryx were using this rebel general to sow discord within their kingdom. As such, this rebel army wasn't so simple. They not only had a charismatic leader, but they were receiving support from an enemy even Alexander the Apex could only share land with. This sort of situation was something Michael wanted to stay far out of. Or, at the very least, he wanted to share the burden with numerous nobles so that he didn't have to take the brunt of the blame. But he just had to open his mouth and call Norman a cuckold. Why did you think Norman was laughing so uproariously? It was because he not only gained another chance to take a dig at the king he hated with all his being, but he knew that he was dragging Michael down with him. The moment the words cuckold left Michael's lips, his fate was sealed. Now he had no choice but to succeed. Michael looked around, but not a single noble dared to look him in the eye. Quite noble indeed. Alexander walked through the castle with a dull expression. He wore fiery red robes and had a single silver shoulder guard over his left shoulder. It gave him the dignified air of a warrior king, although he hadn't been on a battlefield in decades. Alexander pushed open a door. "Royal Father." A young man who seemed to be in his mid-20s immediately stood. The location was a small garden that contained a concrete space for sword practice. Considering the drenched state of the young man and the numerous felled sparring partners nearby, filling the air with a bloody scent, it was clear that he had been taking advantage of this training area until his father arrived. In the distance, a young lady sat by a stone fountain. Her eyes quite dead, she stared off into space without a word and seemed to show no intention of greeting the king. "Come with me. Bring the girl," Alexander said expressionlessly. "Yes." The prince, Rowland, didn't hesitate to follow his father's order. Alexander's steps were already far away by the time the words drifted to his ears, but he didn't dally. Without much care or affection, Rowland grabbed the girl's tender arm and pulled her up, dragging her along with him. Seeing that she didn't seem to want to move, he threw her over his shoulder, uncaring that the location he had grabbed her arm at had already begun to bruise. Not long later, Rowland found his father's back waiting by a set of stairs that headed underground. Seeing Rowland's arrival, Alexander began to descend. Chapter 755. Chapter 755. Godhood. Rowland didn't say a word as he followed his father. Even though he had been to this garden almost every day of his life without ever seeing this staircase, he still didn't say anything. He knew his father well. Even as his son, he didn't dare to take a single step out of line. His father spoke when and only when he wanted to. No question, no words, no insult could ever budge him from his own pace of doing things. However, the more Rowland saw, the more he found it difficult not to say a word. The underground space was impossibly vast. At first, Rowland thought that it must span at least the whole garden. Then he became certain that it spanned at least the whole castle. But, by the end, he wasn't even certain if even the entire royal city was as large as it. There was nothing but a large gray expanse held up by pilar that must have been at least 100 meters tall and 10 meters thick. Just standing by one of them could make one feel like an ant without goal or purpose. And, just walking within such a large space made one feel as though you would never reach your destination. Yet, though it took several hours, they eventually did. From start to finish, as though to allow his son to soak everything in, Alexander never increased his pace. He took one step after another, his feet perfectly spaced and the cadence of the two of his shoes resonating in perfect, controlled harmony. It was then they reached those doors, those very doors that Rowland would never forget so long as he lived. Compared to the pillars, they weren't very tall, just 10 meters or so. Yet, their presence was so much larger that Rowland felt as though he was being suffocated. The doors were the only color in this large expanse of gray. They were cast in a heavy, solid bronze. Even without trying to open them personally, Rowland felt that he would never have the strength needed to open them alone. On its face, ancient runes were drawn across it. The more one stared at it, the more it felt like one's vision was blurring. Rowland lost himself in the runes, suddenly finding himself imagining the start of the world. There was nothing but endless darkness until a hand seemed to reach down from nowhere and began to form things as it pleased. Rowland couldn't even last through the formation of the first star before his brain practically combusted, his nose erupting in a rain of blood that almost made him pass out completely. The only reason he didn't was because he knew what would happen to him if he failed here. His father could always have another son, but he only had this one chance. Swaying, Rowland managed to stay on his feet, his jaw trembling as he grit his teeth. He bit down so hard that a tooth of his cracked in half, almost splintering completely through. But it was this pain that managed to keep him awake. Without a word, nor even a faint acknowledgement, Alexander placed his palms on the doors and pushed hard. At first, all Rowland saw was a blinding light. But what he saw next almost made him drop the girl slinked over his shoulder. His father, the man he respected most in his life, the king who seemed to hold the world in the palm of his hands, dropped to his knees and kowtowed with such fervor that the banging of his forehead against the ground made Rowland feel as though his ears were ringing. Rowland stood frozen, his gaze traveled up and into the room, only to find that within the entire expanse, there was nothing but a singular silver tablet. It sat upon a pedestal, a river of flowing energy hovering around it without a sound. There was nothing present to even acknowledge his father's kowtowing. Moments later, Alexander stood. "Give me the girl." "Ah, yes." Rowland passed the young girl over to his father. Despite the fact that both of them stepped into the room, Alexander didn't say anything about his son having to kowtow. Instead, he began to speak of things Rowland didn't know how to accept. In this world, every being is separated by their worth. Alexander placed the girl down on an altar before the silver tablet, stripping all of her clothes off. Yet even to this point the girl hadn't reacted with even a flinch. It was only at that moment that Rowland understood. He was the only one who was here for the first time. This world that we live in is nothing more than the fifth dimension. However, even then, most who live upon it are just of the fourth dimension because even amongst other fifth-dimensional worlds, we are weak. Alexander brought out a blade, cutting into the young girl just above where her womb would be. One would have expected crimson blood to flow out, and that it did. However, there were very clear specks of gold mixed within that caught Rowland completely off guard. These specks of gold poured down the side of her hips and between her legs, pooling around the altar. However, after reaching a certain point, even as blood continued to flow, the pooling blood didn't continue to rise. Clearly it was being siphoned somewhere. Compared to the fifth dimension, those of the sixth dimension are gods. Compared to the sixth dimension, those of the seventh dimension are deities. Compared to the seventh dimension, those who could step into the eighth were beings beyond comprehension. At that moment, the silver tablet began to glow with a slightly crimson light that slowly grew more golden. To many, this is where the limit of the universe is. Not everything has to end in beautiful round numbers. The world is often not perfect. After all, there is no real tangible thing as the first dimension. At the very least, it hasn't been properly observed. As for the second dimension, some say that word of mouth and stories can be placed into this category, but even then, the consensus is not there. It could be said that the first dimension to truly exist is the third and the last is the eighth. Even the strongest existences in our dimensional verse is of the eighth dimension, and all of them are recluse entities that haven't appeared in countless epochs. An awkward 5 states of beings, 5 steps to ascend to the true apex, to true godhood. But there is still one more. The true overlords of all that there is, the only existences truly worthy of being called God, the creators. Or as some would like to call them, the existences of the ninth dimension. Chapter 756. Chapter 756. Rowland could hardly understand the words his father was speaking. But each and every one weighed on his heart like a booming war drum. The ninth dimension? Even to those of the Morales family it was nothing more than a mythical existence. In fact, even to those of these ever-elusive eighth-dimensional families and organizations, such a level doesn't exist, though many have tried to push past these limits. There was a reason why Earth, despite only having eighth-dimensional potential, is still seen as a hot commodity by the dimensional verse as a whole. To put these matters into perspective, as far as the dimensional verse laymen are concerned, the seventh dimension is the absolute highest. Existences like the Morales family, then, are seen as being the pinnacle. It is only organizations on the Morales family's level, at this ever-elusive seventh dimension, that understand there is at least one more step to take. But to them, whether these eighth-dimensional families and organizations exist is still a mystery. Now one can properly understand just how ridiculous Alexander's words were. He spoke of an existence a step beyond even what the Morales family could prove existed, as though he had personally witnessed it all with his own eyes. Yet, he himself admitted to the fact that he was nothing more than a king of one of the weakest fifth-dimensional worlds in existence. Rowland couldn't think so deeply about these things. He didn't have enough scope of understanding to grasp what his father spoke about. In his mind, this world was the only one and his family was the strongest. But this time it seemed that reality had played a joke on him. Rowland looked down at the girl who was meant to be his wife. She had a wound right above her womb cut open, flowing out with ever-goldening blood. However, she stared at seemingly nothing blankly, her body being almost lifeless. If Rowland couldn't understand by now, he would be too much of a fool. His father hadn't given him Norman's fiancée for the sake of making him happy, nor was it because he had begged and pleaded for it. His father had given him this woman only because it would be more convenient for him to use her like this. What reddish gold blood was flowing out of her at this moment was clearly very important to this tablet. However, none of this explained what this tablet was and what it could do. Rowland opened his mouth to ask, but he hesitated. He really couldn't afford to make a mistake at this critical juncture. There was a reason his father hadn't shown him this until just now. For some reason, Rowland was certain that if his performance wasn't perfect, he would never walk out of here alive. Cold sweat began to drench Rowland. His skin became tingly and the room's temperature seemed far hotter now than it had been in the past. Without even understanding what he was doing, he kneeled down, smashing his forehead against the ground toward the tablet. His kowtows were even more resounding than his father's, even to the point where blood trickled down and stung his eyes and salted his lips. For the first time since they entered, Alexander looked back. It was just slight, but if one had been looking closely, it seemed as though two slits just beneath his eyes had closed at that exact moment. "Come here." This voice was almost like the call of an angel to Rowland. He realized then that he had finally done the right thing and managed to transverse this tribulation. Soon, father and son stood before a bleeding young woman in the nude. Rowland took a deep breath, suddenly feeling as though his body was invigorated. The bottleneck he had been at for years suddenly shattered and he stepped into Tier 8 of the fourth dimension. The prince stood frozen in shock. He had only breathed in a small bit of the air this tablet had to offer, but he had broken through so easily? Rowland looked toward his father but didn't have the words to say. He might look like he was in his mid-20s, but he was way older than this. Even though he trained hard, he still found it difficult to reach this step, something that pissed him off especially when everyone seemed to want to compare him to Norman. Yet this tablet had done exactly that. Rowland's eyes glowed with a fervor even beyond his father's. "Soon we will be able to call down the gods. The true gods," Alexander said, his voice quivering just the slightest bit. It was imperceptible to most, even his own son. "When that day comes, this world will be ours. But that will only be the very first step. With God's strength, we will claim the dimensional verse for our own." If Lionel had been there, these talks would have sounded eerily familiar to his ear. General news will have reached the capital by now and they will definitely be preparing countermeasures. There's a good chance that they may send one of their titled knights. Within a military tent of beast skin, Lionel sat listening to a report given by one of his scouting units. The young man was dressed like an assassin, but also wore goggles over his eyes as he squinted toward a report. Over the past month and a half or so, Lionel had gathered up many subordinates. But it could be said that the ones he trusted with the most tasks were Rowland and this young orphan everyone called Goggles. "A titled knight, huh?" Lionel smiled. "How powerful are they?" "Powerful. Each and every one is at least Tier 7 with the strongest being Tier 8. But that's not what's important. There are plenty of experts on that level in the kingdom, which is why I keep saying we're all going to die. You know, if everyone just listened to me, we could still turn back right now and trek into a distant mountain somewhere and never return. How would they ever find us? At worst, we could just live off nature for the rest of our lives. All right, Goggles. Get back to the point." He really was a greatly talented young man. Too bad he was afraid of everything. You're tuning in to the Han Lee's Wuxia Chronicles YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.